The man grabbed her trunk and hurled it into the dirt road, like it weighed nothing, like she weighed nothing. The lead road agent, a thick-necked brute with a red kerchief pulled to his eyes, pointed his pistol directly at Elowen Pierce's face and said 4 words she would never forget for the rest of her life. "Take off the ring." It was the last thing her dead husband had ever placed on her finger. She took it off. He pocketed it without looking at her again, the way a man pockets a button, something small and meaningless, and then the riders were gone, swallowed by the Wyoming dust, leaving Elowen standing in the middle of nowhere with a torn dress, a bruised jaw, empty hands, and the certain knowledge that the man waiting for her in Redstone Hollow would take one look at what she'd become and send her straight back east. She almost didn't board that stagecoach again. She almost didn't go at all. But then she thought about the little girl. If you've ever lost something you cannot replace and kept walking anyway, then this story belongs to you. Stay with me until the very end, because what happens inside that cold Wyoming ranch will reach right through your screen and grab hold of something you thought you'd buried long ago. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, please take just a moment and subscribe to this channel. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. And after you've watched, I want you to drop a comment and tell me the name of the city or country where you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Thousands of people across the world find these stories every week, and every single comment reminds me why we keep telling them. Hit like if you believe some people deserve a second chance, and let's begin. The stagecoach had been running 2 hours behind schedule since Cheyenne, and Silas Crowley had been standing in the same spot outside Redstone Hollow's general store for most of that time, turning his hat in his hands until the brim was damp from his grip. He was not a man given to nervous gestures. 35 years old, broad-shouldered from a decade of ranching work, with a face that had been weathered past the point of ever looking young again, Silas Crowley did not fidget. He'd pulled calves from mud, buried a wife, raised a daughter alone for 2 winters, and kept a cattle operation running through seasons that broke stronger men. Fidgeting was not something Silas did, and yet here he was, turning the same hat in the same hands, shifting his weight from boot to boot, and checking the eastern road every 40 seconds like he expected it to change. Beside him, pressed against his left leg with her cheek against his coat sleeve, stood Maisie. 7 years old and barely the height of a fence post, she had her mother's dark eyes and her father's talent for silence. She hadn't said a word in the past hour. She almost never said a word to anyone except her father, and even then only when she absolutely had to. The other children in Redstone Hollow had mostly stopped trying to include her after the first winter. It was easier to call her odd than to understand that she was simply full of a grief she didn't have the language for yet. Maisie had been 5 when her mother died. She remembered enough to understand what was missing. She didn't remember enough to stop, hoping someone might fill it. Silas had written 3 letters before Elowen Pierce wrote back. He'd answered an agency advertisement out of desperation more than hope, describing himself with the kind of blunt honesty that probably cost him a dozen replies from women who wanted a charming prospect, widower, 35. 1 daughter, age 7, ranch outside Redstone Hollow, Wyoming territory. I am not a difficult man, but I am a quiet one. My daughter needs someone steady more than she needs someone cheerful. I would rather be honest with you now than disappoint you later. He'd half expected no response at all. Instead, he'd gotten Elowen. Her first letter was 3 pages, written in a hand that pressed hard on the downstrokes, like she was afraid the words might blow away if she didn't anchor them firmly to the page. She told him about her years in Ohio, about teaching herself to preserve fruit and salt pork and make candles from tallow, because her first husband, Thomas, had been a gentleman, but not a practical one. She told him about losing Thomas to a fever that moved too fast for any doctor to reach them. She mentioned just briefly, in a single line near the bottom of the 2nd page, that she had also lost a son, and that she did not wish to say more about it in a letter, but that he should know it had happened. That single restrained line told Silas more about Elowen Pierce than 3 pages of biography could have. A woman who had survived that and still sat down to write carefully, honestly, to a stranger that was not a fragile woman. That was not a woman who had given up. He didn't know what she looked like, and in his first reply he told her plainly that he didn't care, which was the truth. He had not been looking for a young beauty. He had been looking for someone who would sit beside Maisie at the end of a hard day and mean it. 4 months of letters, long ones on both sides. He knew she was frightened of traveling alone. He knew she made the best biscuits of her life when she was anxious, because baking gave her hands something useful to do. He knew she still slept on the right side of every bed out of a habit she couldn't break. He knew she sometimes talked to Thomas when she was alone, not out of delusion, but out of the particular loneliness of loving someone who is gone and having nowhere to put it. He'd told her things, too, about the way the first winter alone with Maisie nearly undone him. About burning his wife Clara's good Sunday dress by accident while trying to wash it, and how he'd sat on the kitchen floor next to the scorched fabric for an hour before Maisie found him and simply climbed into his lap without asking why. About being afraid that he was raising a quiet, wounded little girl into a quiet, wounded woman and not knowing how to stop it. He knew Elowen Pierce's interior life better than he'd known most people's faces. And now the eastern road was moving. He heard the stagecoach before he saw it, the familiar hammer of hooves and the groan of iron wheels over hard-packed clay, pushing a column of dust up against the pale autumn sky. Maisie straightened beside him. She didn't reach for his hand, but she leaned slightly forward, like something in her was straining without permission. Silas made himself stop turning his hat. The coach pulled in. Brakes shrieked. The driver called down something to the man who ran the livery, and 2 passengers stepped out first, a merchant with a valise and a red-faced man who looked like he'd been drinking since Laramie. Then the door swung open a 3rd time, and Silas Crowley felt the bottom drop out of his stomach. The woman who stepped down from that coach did not look like someone who had simply endured a long journey. She looked like someone who had fought her way through one. Her dress, plainly made to begin with, a sensible brown traveling dress, the kind a practical woman would choose, was torn at the left shoulder, and along the hemline, the fabric hanging in a way that spoke of violence rather than wear. Her face, which was sharp-featured and not unkind even now, carried a bruise along the left jaw that had blossomed to a purple green that made Silas's hands tighten involuntarily at his sides. Her hair, which had clearly been pinned with care when she started the journey, was half collapsed, several dark strands loose against her neck. She had no trunk, no bag, nothing. She stepped down from that coach with one hand braced on the doorframe to keep herself steady, and she stood for a moment just breathing, like a person who has been running and has finally allowed herself to stop. Then she looked up, and her eyes, dark brown, slightly too wide, the eyes of someone who had been keeping a great deal of composure for a very long time, moved along the small crowd of onlookers until they found Silas. She knew him immediately. He had described himself accurately. Most men didn't, and the moment she found his face, her own did something complicated. It went through 3 separate expressions in the space of 2 seconds, something like relief, something like shame, and then something that closed down over both of them like a shutter being drawn, professional and careful. A woman steeling herself for a conversation she had already rehearsed a dozen times in her head. She walked toward him, not quickly, not with the eager energy of a woman arriving at something hopeful. Steadily, like a person walking towards something necessary. She stopped 3 feet away. She did not pretend, which he would later remember and be grateful for. "Mr. Crowley," she said. Her voice was lower than he'd imagined from the letters. A little rough at the edges, whether from the journey or from crying or from hours of dry Wyoming air, he couldn't tell. "I expect you can see what's happened." "I can," he said. "Road agents, 2 hours out of Cheyenne." Her jaw tightened. "They took everything, the trunk, my money, my extra clothes." A pause, very brief, very controlled. "There were some things in the trunk that I cannot replace." I want you to know that before we say anything else, because it affects how I'm standing here right now. Silas understood what she wasn't saying. The things you put in a trunk to carry across 1,000 miles into a new life are not clothes. They are what you are refusing to leave behind. I understand, he said. I cannot reimburse you for the travel expense. She kept her eyes on his face, which he recognized as an act of considerable will. It would have been easier to look away. She didn't. I have nothing on me except what I'm wearing. I know that puts you in an impossible position, and I know that is not what you agreed to, and I want you to know that I am prepared to. If you need me to make other arrangements, I will not make any difficulty about it. I'll find work somewhere in town if the schoolhouse needs. Miss Pierce. She stopped. He hadn't meant to interrupt her. But he'd heard enough. The thing that struck him, that would strike him later when he turned it over in his mind, was not the bruise or the torn dress or the missing trunk. It was the offer she'd just made him. An offer to disappear quietly without costing him anything, without making a scene, without demanding what she might reasonably have argued she was owed. She had arrived in the worst possible circumstances, and her first instinct had been to make it easier on him. That was a person who had been disappointing people her whole life, or believed she had. You learned that posture from years of practice. He didn't get a chance to say what he'd been about to say. Because Maisie stepped forward. Silas hadn't felt her move. One moment she was pressed against his left leg as she'd been for the past hour, and then she was simply not. She was 3 steps ahead of him, and then 4, and she walked directly to Elowen Pierce, without hesitation, without shyness, without any of the careful sideways approach she used with every adult outside her father and the ranch cook. She walked straight to the bruised woman standing with nothing in her hands, and she reached up and took one of those empty hands in both of hers. Just that, no words, just the small deliberate weight of a child's grip. Elowen looked down, and whatever composure she had been holding together, with sheer will that composure fractured. Not dramatically, not in tears, it was quieter than that. It was the way a person's face changes when something touches the exact place they've been guarding. Her eyes filled but didn't spill, her chin dipped. She looked at Maisie's hands wrapped around hers, and she stood very still for a moment, like she was afraid to breathe wrong and break something. Maisie looked up at her father. Her voice, when she spoke, was just loud enough to carry the 3 feet between them. Can she come home with us? Silas Crowley looked at the woman his daughter had already decided about. He looked at the bruise, the torn dress, the empty hands. He looked at his daughter's face, Maisie, who didn't speak to strangers, who spent her evenings telling a ragdoll the things she was afraid to say aloud, who had not really laughed, the full-body kind since before her mother got sick. He looked back at Elowen Pierce, who was still looking down at his daughter's hands, holding hers, and who had not moved an inch toward manipulating this situation, had not made any appeal to his sympathy, had offered nothing except the quiet and humiliating truth of what had happened to her. Yes, he said, she can. He stepped forward and picked up the conversation where Elowen had expected it to end. He told her in plain, direct terms because he did not know any other kind that he had not spent 4 months writing letters to a trunk. He had not paid a travel expense because he expected a woman to arrive with a certain number of possessions or a certain sum of money in her pocket. What he had told the agency he wanted was a woman who could be steady for his daughter, and the letters he had received over 4 months suggested that was exactly what Elowen Pierce was, and nothing he was looking at right now changed that. She stared at him through this entire speech with an expression he couldn't quite categorize. It wasn't relief. It wasn't gratitude, exactly. It was the look of a person who had prepared so thoroughly for a certain outcome that a different one didn't quite register yet. You don't know me, she said quietly. Not really. Letters aren't. No, he agreed, but neither do you know me. That was always going to be true, Miss Pierce, regardless of what arrived in the trunk. Something shifted in her face. Not a smile, she was too wrung out for a smile, but a loosening. Like she'd been holding a breath she'd taken somewhere in Ohio. Maisie had not let go of her hand. The drive back to Crowley Ranch was quiet, which suited all three of them. The territory spread around them in the flat, enormous way of Wyoming. In late autumn, the grass beaten pale by the changing season, the sky low and moving with the kind of clouds that meant real cold was coming. Elowen sat in the wagon bed with Maisie pressed against her side, not asked to, not invited exactly, just situated there the way a small animal finds warmth without making ceremony of it. Silas drove and said nothing, because there was nothing yet that needed to be said. Elowen watched the land go by and kept her thoughts where she could manage them. She had not told Silas everything about the robbery. She had told him what was factual: the riders, the trunk, the money, the ring. She had not told him that she had stood at the side of that road for 20 minutes after the stagecoach rolled on, genuinely considering whether to simply walk in the other direction. She had not told him that the ring had been on her right hand, moved there after Thomas died, and that the agent who took it had looked her dead in the eye while he did it, and that something about that particular cruelty had hollowed her out in a way the loss of the money hadn't. She had not told him that she'd spent the rest of that coach ride arguing with herself about whether she was a fool for continuing, about whether a woman who had already buried a husband and a child had any right to ask the world for more than survival. She hadn't figured out the answer to that yet. What she knew, sitting in this wagon with her shoulder pressed against this small, serious child who had decided something about her before Elowen had spoken a single word, what she knew was that she was here. She had gotten on the coach. She had gotten off the coach. She had walked across that hard dirt to the man waiting for her and told him the truth. That was as far ahead as she could see. The ranch came into view as the light was going. Elowen looked at the house, two-story, solidly built, in need of paint along the south-facing wall where the weather had worked at it, smoke already rising from the kitchen chimney where a cook named Gus had apparently been on duty since early afternoon. It was not a grand house. It was not a broken one. It was the house of someone who kept things functional without having anyone around to care about the difference between functional and beautiful. She understood that immediately. She understood it the way you recognize a quality in someone else that you've spent a long time recognizing in yourself. Maisie, for the first time in the whole ride, tugged at Elowen's sleeve. Elowen looked down. The little girl pointed at the house, then looked up at her with those dark, careful eyes and said in the smallest voice Elowen had ever heard carry a full sentence, "Your room is next to mine." I checked. Elowen held herself together. It took everything she had, but she held herself together. "Did you?" she managed. Maisie nodded, already looking away, like she hadn't just handed Elowen something enormous. Silas had heard. He said nothing, but the line of his shoulders, which had been carrying a year's worth of a particular kind of tension, shifted almost imperceptibly the way a man breathes out when he hadn't realized he was holding his breath. They went inside, and that was the beginning of what none of them yet had the courage to call hope. What happens next inside Crowley Ranch? The silent evenings, the slow thawing, the first real laughter Vasey's has made in 2 years, and the night a winter storm arrives that will put everything and everyone to the test continues in part 2. The first night at Crowley Ranch, Elowen didn't sleep. She lay in the room Maisie had told her about, the one next door, separated by a wall thin enough that she could hear the child's breathing shift as she settled into sleep, and she stared at the ceiling and took inventory of what she had left. It was not a long list. The dress she was wearing, badly damaged. A pair of stockings, a small bone comb she'd had in her coat pocket because she'd used it on the coach and hadn't put it back. That was everything. Everything she owned in the world fit in one coat pocket and could be counted in under 10 seconds. She had done this kind of accounting before. After Thomas died, after the baby, she had sat in a chair in a house that suddenly belonged to his family and not to her, and she had counted what remained. It had not taken long then either. The difference was that this time, on the other side of a thin wall, a 7-year-old girl was sleeping with her face turned toward the sound of Elowen's breathing. She knew this because before Maisie went to bed, she had cracked her door open 2 inches and left it that way. Silas had noticed and said nothing. Elowen had noticed and said nothing. The crack of light from Maisie's lamp fell across the hallway floor in a thin yellow line, and Elowen watched it from her own bed and felt something she didn't have an immediate name for. Not comfort. Not yet. Something smaller than comfort, but in the same general direction. She got up at 4:30 because she couldn't do anything useful lying down. The kitchen was cold. When she reached it, the stove banked low overnight. She spent 10 minutes figuring out where everything was: the wood box, the kindling, the matches, the coffee tin. She made mistakes. She put too much kindling on before the flame caught properly and had to start over. She found the coffee on the second shelf where Silas apparently kept it, behind a tin of cornmeal that had been there long enough to develop a fine coat of dust. She set the coffee on and stood with her back to the warm iron while it came to temperature, her arms folded, her jaw still tender when she pressed her tongue against her back teeth. Gus the cook found her there when he came in at 5. He was a short, wide man somewhere north of 60, with a gray beard he kept trimmed close and the permanently skeptical expression of someone who had been surprised by life too many times to leave himself open to it. He stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at her and the coffee and the already warming stove, and something moved in his face that was probably recalibration. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know," she said. I was awake. He came in and hung his coat and looked at the coffee pot and then back at her, clearly deciding something. "You know how to cook?" he said. Not unkindly, just directly. "Yes. He didn't hire you to cook. I know that too." She reached for the cups she'd found them on the third shelf, mismatched, 2 of them chipped, and poured him one without being asked. "I'm not trying to take your kitchen. I just needed something to do with my hands." He sat down at the table, wrapped both his around the cup, and looked at her with those careful eyes. Then he said, "Your face looks bad, I know. He's a decent man, Crowley." "In case you were wondering, I wasn't," she said. And then, more honestly, I was a little. Gus drank his coffee and didn't offer more than that, which she respected. The kitchen filled slowly with warmth and the smell of grounds, and neither of them felt the need to fill the silence with words it didn't require. When Silas came down at 6, he found them both at the table with empty cups, not talking, which apparently registered to him as something close to a good sign, because the line between his brows, the one that had been there the entire previous afternoon, was slightly less deep than it had been. He poured his own coffee and stood at the counter and looked at Elowen, and what he said was, "You slept." Some, she said, which was technically true if you counted the half hour she'd lost somewhere around 3. He let it go. He understood, she thought, that there were certain adjustments a person needed to make, and that pressing on them did not speed the process. Maisie came down at 6:40, still in her nightgown, her hair a disaster from sleep, her feet in wool stockings that didn't match. She stopped at the kitchen doorway when she saw Elowen the same way Gus had, with that same brief recalibration, and then she came in and sat down at the table directly across from her, tucked her feet up under herself on the chair, and accepted the bowl of porridge Gus put in front of her without taking her eyes off Elowen. Elowen looked back. "Good morning," Elowen said. "Morning," Maisie said. A pause. Then, with the particular directness of a child who had not yet learned the social value of indirection, "Your face looks worse than yesterday." "Maisie," Silas said from the counter. "It does, though." "It's all right," Elowen said. She touched her jaw lightly. "It looks worse before it gets better. It'll be gone in a week." She said this with the matter-of-fact tone of someone who had enough experience with the progression of bruises to speak about them accurately, which was true in a general way. She'd nursed enough injuries over the years, and Maisie's absorbed this with a small nod, apparently satisfied by the specificity. "Does it hurt?" Maisie asked. "Yes," Elowen said, "but not as much as it did." Maisie nodded again, then looked down at her porridge and began to eat. And that was how they had their first real conversation, briefly, directly, with no performance on either side, which was, as it turned out, almost exactly the right register for both of them. The first week was the kind of careful that felt exhausting to maintain. Everyone in the house was trying not to want too much, and everyone could tell that everyone else was trying, and Lee's awareness of it sat in every room like a third party that hadn't been introduced. Elowen took her meals with the family and helped with things she could help with without stepping on Gus's territory. The mending, the laundry, the sweeping, and each day she waited to see whether Silas would decide this had been a mistake. He didn't seem to be deciding that. He was also not easy to read. He was not cold, but he was contained the way a man gets when he spent a long time having no one to be open with. He said what needed to be said about the ranch and the schedule and the way things worked, and he asked her questions in the evenings, practical ones at first, about what she needed, whether her room was warm enough, whether she had everything she required, and listened to her answers with a quality of attention that she wasn't entirely used to. Most people listen to you with part of their attention, while the rest of them was already composing their response. Silas listened with all of it, and then he was quiet for a moment before he said anything, which she initially read as slowness and eventually understood was care. Maisie was different with her when Silas wasn't in the room. When her father was present, Maisie was the quiet, watchful child Elowen had met at the stagecoach. When he wasn't, when it was just Elowen and Maisie in the kitchen after lunch or upstairs in the hallway before bed, something in the child loosened by a fraction. Not dramatically. She didn't become talkative or eager. But she would drift closer. She would appear in doorways when Elowen was in a room, not asking to come in, just appearing available. She had a habit of showing Elowen things without comment, a worn book, a feather she'd found, a smooth piece of quartz she kept on her windowsill, handing them over and waiting to see what Elowen did with them. What Elowen did was look at them seriously, ask a question or two, and hand them back. It was, she would later think, exactly the right thing. You didn't perform enthusiasm for a child like Maisie. She could see through it in seconds, and she would close up like a fist. You took what she offered with the same weight she offered it, and you showed her she'd been heard. On the 9th day, Maisie knocked on Elowen's door after supper. Elowen was at the small table in her room trying to write a letter to the woman at the agency who had arranged her travel to let her know she had arrived, and she'd crossed out several words here, and settled on settled. The knock was so light she almost missed it. "Come in," she said. Maisie came in carrying her rag doll, which Elowen had seen before but never held, and which Maisie never voluntarily put within reach of other people. She stood just inside the doorway, with the doll pressed against her chest, and looked at Elowen's table. "What are you writing?" she asked. "A letter. To let someone know I got here safely." Maisie came 3 steps closer. Her eyes moved to the paper, then to Elowen's face. "Are you going to tell them you're staying?" The question landed with more weight than Maisie probably meant it to carry. Elowen set down her pen and turned in her chair to face her. "Yes," she said. "I'm going to tell them I'm staying." Maisie held the doll a little tighter. "Are you?" she said. Not accusatory. Just asking, just making sure the words matched the fact. "I am," Elowen said, a beat. Then Maisie walked the rest of the way to the table and sat down in the other chair, the one against the wall that Elowen had pushed there the first morning, and set the doll in her lap and watched Elowen finish the letter. She didn't ask to read it. She didn't say anything at all. She just sat there, and Elowen wrote, and the lamp threw warm light across both of them, and outside the wind was starting to come up with the particular voice that Wyoming wind had in October. When the letter was done and folded, Maisie said, "Her name is Agnes." It took Elowen a moment. Then she looked at the doll. "Agnes," she repeated, "that's a good name." "She doesn't talk much," Maisie said, completely serious, "but she listens." "Those are the best kind," Elowen said, equally serious. Maisie stood up, tucked Agnes back under her arm, and went to the door. Then she stopped, and without turning around, she said in a voice that was careful and small, and trying very hard not to sound like it was asking for something, "You can braid hair, right? Papa said you could." "I can," Elowen said. "Mine's a mess," Maisie said. "Gus tries, but he's not good at it." "I noticed," Elowen said gently. Maisie went out without another word. The next morning, after breakfast, Maisie positioned herself in front of Elowen's chair with a brush and didn't need to say anything at all. This was how the days began to change. Not quickly. Not in a single rush of warmth and resolution. Nothing in that house moved like that. It moved the way cold earth warms in spring, gradually from the inside out, and you only noticed the change when you looked back at where you'd been. Maisie started laughing more. Not the polite, cautious kind of laugh a child produces when an adult says something they feel expected to find funny, real laughter. Not the kind that came out of her before she could decide whether to let it. Usually because of something small and ridiculous. A rooster who had developed an intense personal grudge against Gus's boot, or the way Elowen mispronounced a ranch term, and a horse reacted to it with what Maisie decided was indignation. The first time it happened, the real laugh, the full one, Silas heard it from across the yard. He had been repairing a section of fence at the far end of the corral, and the sound of it stopped him as completely as a hand on his shoulder would have. He stood there with a post-hole digger in his hands and listened, and his throat did something inconvenient, and he went back to work without looking toward the house. He didn't know what to do with the feeling, so he put it in the same place he'd been putting difficult feelings for 2 years, somewhere quiet and internal, where it could sit without demanding anything of him. Elowen noticed him noticing. She was not a woman who missed much. She began to understand Silas Crowley in the way you understand a place. Not all at once, but by moving through it and seeing where the walls were. He was not unkind to anyone on the ranch. The two hands who worked for him, Garrett and young Pete, spoke about him with the short, undecorated respect that men give a boss they actually trust rather than merely tolerate. He paid fairly and expected the same in return, and did not ask his men to do work he wouldn't do himself. He made no ceremony of anything. He would sit at supper and eat the same food without comment, and if the biscuits were good, he might say good biscuits, and if they weren't, he'd eat them anyway. But there were places in him that had been sealed for a long time, and you could feel them the way you feel a room in a house that no one opens, not because something bad happened there, exactly, but because what happened there was too important to risk casually. He talked about Clara, his first wife, once in the 3rd week. Not at length. They were on the porch after supper in the cold evening air, both of them with cups of coffee they weren't really drinking, and Maisie was inside with Gus, who was teaching her to play cards badly, and the laughter from inside was intermittent and warm. And Silas was looking at the dark middle distance the way he did when he was thinking something he hadn't decided whether to say. She would have liked you, he said. Elowen looked at him. Clara, he said. She was a good judge of character. Fast about it, too. She'd have made up her mind about you in about 5 minutes. He paused. Maisie gets that from her. Maisie made up her mind before I said a word, Elowen said. I know. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. Clara would have said that meant something. Elowen was quiet for a moment. The wind was low tonight, almost kind, which was unusual for October out here. My husband Thomas, she said, because it felt wrong not to offer something equal, used to say that if you wanted to know the truth about a person, you watched what they did when no one was looking. She paused. I thought about that when I got off the coach. I was certain you'd send me away when you saw what I looked like. It crossed my mind, Silas said. She looked at him. He said it plainly, without apology, and she appreciated that more than any comfortable lie would have cost him. And she said, and then Maisie moved, he said. And that was that. Elowen looked back at the dark beyond the porch. Something in her chest shifted, settling, the way a bone does when it returns to the right position after being held too long at a wrong angle. Do you talk to her? She asked. Still, a pause. Then sometimes, not often anymore. He glanced at her. Do you? Every day, she said. Both of them. She hadn't told him about the baby in any detail. He'd known from the letter that there had been a son, and he had not asked, and she had not offered, because some things needed time before they could be handled without damage. He nodded. He didn't tell her it was strange or that she ought to stop. He just nodded, the way a man nods at a fact that requires no correction. It was, she would think later, one of the kindest things anyone had ever done with the things she'd told them. The trouble with Redstone Hollow started in earnest around week 4. It had been simmering before that she'd felt it in the way women looked at her when Silas brought her into town to replace what the road agents had taken. The way conversations paused and resumed at a slightly different pitch when she entered the general store. She was not from here. She had arrived without anything. She was living in a single man's house before any formal arrangement had been made permanent, which was a fact the more pious residents of Redstone Hollow had noted and were apparently discussing with enthusiasm. She first heard it directly from a woman named Ruth Callahan, who ran the dry goods counter and had apparently decided that directness was a virtue she was entitled to exercise on behalf of the community. "I don't mean anything unkind by it," Ruth said, which was the traditional precursors to something unkind. "But people are wondering about your situation, Mrs. Pierce, what exactly you are out at the Crowley place." Elowen was looking at bolts of fabric because she needed to replace her dress and had approximately enough mutzi from what Silas had given her not lent. He'd been clear about that, which had been a separate small battle she'd lost to do it simply. She did not look up from the fabric. "I'm a guest," she said. "Temporarily. For a month?" Ruth said. The situation required some adjustment. She selected a bolt. "Plain brown serviceable. I'd like 4 yards of this." "People are saying he ought to marry you proper," Ruth said, in the tone of someone conveying the community's opinion while privately endorsing it. "For the child's sake, for propriety." Elowen put the fabric down and looked at Ruth directly for the first time. "Mrs. Callahan," she said, "I have been in this territory for 4 weeks. I arrived with nothing I came with. The man whose house I am staying in has shown me more decency than I had any right to expect. I would appreciate it if you did not tell him what he ought to do with his own life, on the grounds that it makes other people comfortable." She picked the fabric back up. 4 yards, please." Ruth measured it in silence. The story was around Redstone Hollow by nightfall, which was a speed of travel that impressed Elowen despite herself. What actually traveled the version that most people received was that Elowen Pierce had been rude to Ruth Callahan in the dry goods store. What had actually happened was that Elowen had declined to be intimidated, which in some communities amounts to the same thing. Silas heard about it from Garrett, who'd heard it at the livery. He came in that evening and stood in the kitchen doorway while Elowen was helping Maisie hem a skirt the child had grown out of, or rather, while Maisie was ostensibly learning to hem a skirt and mostly just watching Elowen's hands with deep concentration, and he said, "I heard you had a disagreement with Ruth Callahan today." "Yes," Elowen said without looking up. "What about?" "She wanted to know what I was," Elowen said, and didn't like the answer. Silas leaned against the doorframe and looked at her for a moment. "What did you tell her?" "That I'm a guest, temporarily." Another pause. Something moved in his face that she couldn't quite read. Then he said, very carefully, "Is that what you think you are?" Elowen looked up. Maisie was watching both of them with the absolute stillness of a child who understands that the adults are doing something important and is determined not to interrupt. Elowen said, "I think it's the honest answer." Silas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "All right," and went to get his supper, and Elowen went back to hemming the skirt, and Maisie went back to watching her hands. And the kitchen was warm, and the lamp was steady, and nothing in the room was quite the same as it had been 20 minutes before. That night, the temperature dropped 15 degrees. Silas told her at breakfast that it was early for a drop like that, and that it sometimes meant a hard winter. He said it the way he said most things, plain and without drama, but Gus caught Elowen's eye across the table, and the look on his face was expressive in a way Gus's face did not often allow itself to be. Wyoming winters were not a subject for understatement. Elowen had heard enough in 4 weeks to know that much. Storms that came down from the north without much warning and turned the roads to nothing and kept ranches sealed for days at a time. Cold that had a quality to it that cold in Ohio didn't have a weight, an intent, like it was trying to accomplish something specific. She had brought none of the right clothing for it. She had, in fact, brought nothing at all, Silas had given her a coat. One of Clara's, which he'd brought down from the chest upstairs without ceremony, and handed to her one morning when she'd come outside underdressed, and he'd simply turned around, gone back inside, and come back with it. She'd started to say she couldn't take it, and he'd said she'd want it used, and that had ended the conversation. It fit, which seemed impossible and somehow wasn't. She wore it every day, and sometimes when she put her hands in the pockets, she'd find something small, a dried sprig of something, a button that had come loose, a folded piece of paper that turned out to be a list of things Clara had meant to buy in town and never gotten around to, and she would turn these things in her fingers and put them back. And she would feel something that was not exactly grief and not exactly gratitude, but partook of both. The cold that came in November came fast and stayed. The ranch changed under it. The morning chores took longer in the cold, and the animals were more difficult, and the hands worked with their heads down and their collars up, and conversation was reduced to what was necessary. Insides, the stoves worked harder, and the woodpile went down faster than expected, a fact that sent Garrett and Pete out to split more with an urgency that told Elowen this was not a routine adjustment. Maisie spent more time inside, which meant more time with Elowen. They developed a kind of routine that neither of them planned and neither of them named. Mornings with the braiding and breakfast, afternoons with whatever practical work was available, sewing, mending, the bread that Maisie was slowly and imperfectly learning to make, and evenings in Maisie's room before bed, where Elowen sat on the edge of the child's mattress and told stories. The stories were important. Maisie had made this clear very early on, in her sideways way, not by asking for them directly, but by appearing in her nightgown in Elowen's doorway one evening, and stating that she couldn't sleep, and Elowen had said she'd come and sit with her, and had started to talk, and had watched the child go still and quiet in the particular way that meant she was listening with everything she had. Elowen told her stories she made up, adventures and misadventures, people who made bad decisions and had to live with them, and found ways forward, women who crossed difficult country and arrived somewhere better. She did not make the characters perfect. She gave them fears and made them lose things, and sometimes made them cry in ways that did not resolve immediately into wisdom. Maisie preferred these imperfect characters to the infallible ones. She'd been young when her mother died, but she was old enough to know that the world was not arranged to protect the people she loved. She responded better to stories that knew that. On the first Tuesday of December, Elowen woke up to Silas knocking on her door at 2 a.m. She heard the knock before she heard anything else, the way you hear certain sounds when you're already partly awake and don't know it. She sat up. Her heart was already doing something irregular before she fully understood she was awake. "What is it?" she said through the door. "Maisie," he said. Just the one word, but the quality of it was like a wall falling. She was out of bed and at the door before she'd finished the motion of deciding to move. Silas was in the hallway with a lamp, and his face, composed most of the time, contained the face of a man who had decided to manage himself in most circumstances was not composed. It was stripped. He looked like a man standing at the edge of something he had no way to cross. "She woke up sick," he said. "She's burning up." Elowen went past him without stopping to think. She went directly to Maisie's room and sat on the edge of the bed and put her hand on the child's forehead, and the heat of it hit her palm like an open door in summer, immediate and total. Maisie's eyes were open. She was looking at the ceiling with the specific, unfocused quality that a bad fever produced. Not quite seeing, not quite not seeing, her breath shallow and rapid and wrong. Elowen turned to Silas in the doorway. "How long?" she said. "I don't know. I heard her moving around. Maybe an hour. Get water. Cold as you can get it from the well, not the cistern. And every cloth in the house that can be wetted. Bring the extra blankets from the chest in your room. We need to watch which way this fever moves, whether we keep her warm or cool her." She turned back to Maisie, smoothed the hair from the child's face with both hands. "What medicine is in the house? Is there willow bark? Anything from town? Gus keeps something in the kitchen. Get Gus. Right now." She heard him go without looking. She heard the sound of his boots on the stairs, quick, controlled, not running but close, and she sat in the lamplight with Maisie's fever burning under her hands, and something cold and very specific settled into her chest like a stone dropped in water. She had been here before. The temperatures, the breathing, the quality of the heat. She knew this. She knew it the way you know a road you wish you'd never traveled, every turn still in your body, every landmark still in your eyes. Thomas had looked like this on the second night, before it got worse. The baby, she stopped that thought. She stopped it firmly, the way you put your shoulder against a door and hold it. She was here now, she was present, and she was not helpless. She knew what she hadn't known then, what the fever needed in its first hours, how to keep a person from the edge they didn't know they were near. She had paid an enormous price for that knowledge, and she had carried it across 4 months of letters and 1,000 miles of territory and a robbery that took everything she owned. And she had arrived in this house with nothing in her hands but herself. She looked at Maisie's face in the lamplight, the fever-bright cheeks and the unfocused eyes and the too-fast breath, and she felt something happen in her that was not fear and not grief, but something made of both, something that said, not this child. Not this time. Silas came back with the water. Gus was behind him in his coat over his nightshirt, already carrying the medicine box. Elowen looked up at them both and said, "Here is what we need to do." She told them, clearly, quickly, without hesitation. Who would do what, in what order, what to watch for, when to wake her if she slept, what changes in the fever meant which kind of response. Gus nodded and set to work without comment. Silas stood at the foot of the bed with his hands at his sides, looking at his daughter, and the expression on his face was the most honest thing Elowen had seen from him in 2 months wide open, raw, the face of a man who had already lost the one thing he couldn't survive losing once, and was standing at the edge of losing the other. "Silas," she said. He looked at her. "I need you to be useful tonight," she said. Not unkindly, but directly, the way you speak to someone who is beginning to drown in something internal when there is no time for it. "Can you do that?" He breathed once hard through his nose. Then he said, "Tell me what to do," she told him, and Maisie's fever climbed toward the place where they would have to fight hardest, and the cold outside pressed against the walls of the house, and the long night began. The fever did not peak that first night. That was the thing Elowen had not told Silas, because she needed him steady, and telling him would not have helped him be steady. She knew from the temperature of Maisie's skin, from the quality of her breathing, from the way the child's body was working against itself, that this was not a fever that would resolve quickly. It was going to climb before it fell. It was going to get worse before there was any chance of better. She had seen this exact progression twice before. She had lost both times. She sat beside Maisie's bed in the first gray hours of that Tuesday morning and wrung cold cloths into the wash basin and pressed them to the child's forehead and wrists and the back of her neck. And she listened to Maisie's breathing, and she talked to her. Not about anything important, just a steady, quiet voice in the dark, something for the fever mind to follow, a sound that meant someone was there and was not afraid. Elowen was afraid. She was afraid in a precise, specific way that lived somewhere behind her sternum and pressed outward like something trying to get free. But she did not let it into her voice, because a child in fever does not need your fear, she needs to feel. In every way, she can still perceive through the heat and the confusion that the person beside her is a fixed point. Be a fixed point. That was the whole job. Silas came and went through the night. She had given him tasks, keeping the water cold, stoking the bedroom stove to a careful middle temperature, checking the horses, because the cold outside had deepened, and the animals needed attention, and it gave him somewhere to put the energy that was otherwise going to eat him alive. He understood why she was doing it. He didn't protest. He would disappear for 20 minutes and come back and stand in the doorway and look at Maisie, and then look at Elowen, and she would give him a small nod, still the same, not worse yet, hold on, and he would go. Around 4 a.m, Maisie became delirious. It started as restlessness, the child turning in the bed, pushing at the blankets, her lips moving without sound. Then she began to speak fragmented, disconnected things, half-sentences that belonged to some interior geography Elowen couldn't follow. She said her mother's name once, in a voice so small and so certain that it hit Elowen somewhere that didn't have a name. She said the horse got out with tremendous urgency, twice. Then she went quiet again, just the shallow, rapid breathing in the heat, and Elowen wrung out another cloth and pressed it to her forehead and kept talking, kept her voice even, kept being the fixed point. Silas was in the doorway when Maisie said Clara's name. Elowen heard him make a sound, just one, quickly controlled, and she didn't look at him because she knew that if she looked at him right now, it would cost both of them something they couldn't afford to spend. "Silas," she said quietly, her eyes on Maisie, "go get more cold water." He went. By the second morning, the roads were gone. The storm had come in overnight the way Wyoming storms did, not announcing itself, just arriving, and had packed 2 feet of snow against the south side of every structure on the property and was still putting down more. Garrett went out at first light and came back with ice in his beard and reported that the road to town was impassable, that the drifts across the lower field were chest-high in places, and that the temperature had not risen with the dawn the way it was supposed to. Elowen heard this from the top of the stairs. She had come down to get willow bark tea from Gus, who had been keeping a pot warm on the back of the stove all night. She stood on the bottom step in Clara's coat she'd put it on at 3 in the morning when she'd gotten cold and forgotten to take it off, and she absorbed this information about the roads the way she absorbed most bad news now, without visible reaction, running it through the part of her brain that was still doing triage. No doctor, no additional medicine from town. Whatever she had, whatever Gus had in his medicine box, whatever the ranch storeroom contained, that was what they were working with. She went back upstairs. She did not tell Silas about the roads immediately. She told him when he came back with fresh water, and she told him plainly, and she watched his face go through 3 things very fast and then lock down. And then he said, "What do you need?" "I need you to check the storeroom for anything medicinal." Anything. Dried herbs. Anything Gus might have put up last summer. Garlic, elderberry, anything you don't recognize, bring it up and I'll look at it. "That's it? And I need you to eat something," she said. "You haven't eaten since supper yesterday. You won't be any use to her or me if you go down too." He looked at her for a moment, with that particular expression she had come to understand, meant he was registering something he had not expected. "I'll eat," he said. "Good," he went. She turned back to Maisie. The child was in a complicated place between sleeping and not sleeping, the way high fevers produced not rest, not wakefulness. Something in between that the body retreated into when it was using everything it had to fight. Elowen sat beside her and took her hand. Maisie's hand was small and hot, the bones of it light and precise under the skin, and kept her thumb moving slowly, steadily, the same motion. Something regular and present for whatever part of Maisie was still tracking the outside world. She talked about Ohio. Not the bad parts, not Thomas, not the winter the baby got sick. She talked about the farm she'd grown up on, the apple trees her father had planted before she was born, the way the cellar smelled in October when it was full of what the summer had made. She talked about her mother's kitchen table, how one leg was shorter than the others, and had been shimmed with a folded piece of leather for as long as Elowen could remember. She talked about ordinary things, small things, things that had no consequence except that they were true and specific, and they made the world sound like a place worth being in. She didn't know if Maisie could hear her. She talked anyway. Gus appeared in the doorway at mid-morning with a bowl of broth and put it on the bedside table without a word. He looked at Maisie for a long moment, and Elowen watched his face. And she saw in it the same thing she'd seen in Silas's face, that particular helplessness of someone who has been useful their whole life and has run up against something usefulness cannot directly address. "She's a tough kid," he said, finally. It was not quite a statement and not quite a question. "She is," Elowen said. Her mother was the same. Said it to Maisie, not to Elowen. Clara would get a cold and stay in bed one day and be back at it by the second morning, driving me crazy because she'd want to help with things she wasn't supposed to be doing. Elowen looked at him. He had not spoken much about Clara before. He said things sometimes, small references, practical ones, but not like this. She sounds like someone who didn't know how to stop, Elowen said. Couldn't, it drove Silas halfway to madness. He paused. He'd follow her around, trying to get her to sit down, and she'd pretend not to notice. Something moved in his weathered face. He was different before. Louder. Laugh more. He stopped, apparently deciding he'd said enough, and looked back at Maisie. Eat your broth before it's cold, he left. Elowen ate the broth. It was good Gus cooked with the same undemonstrative competence he did everything, and she ate it without tasting it much, her attention still on Maisie's breathing, still counting the spaces between each. Exhale the way you count intervals between lightning and thunder, measuring the distance of the danger. The second day was the hardest. The fever climbed through the afternoon, past the point where Elowen could maintain the pretense, even to herself, that this was a straightforward illness resolving in a straightforward way. Maisie stopped responding to her name. Her breathing changed, still regular, not crisis level, but shallower, quicker, and the heat of her was something that went through the cloth immediately and defeated it. Elowen changed her strategy. She had Silas bring ice, real ice, broken from the water trough with a hatchet in the bitter outdoor cold, and she packed it in cloth and applied it more aggressively to the wrists, the ankles, the back of the neck, anywhere the blood ran close to the surface. It was harsher than she'd wanted to be. It made Maisie flinch and cry out once briefly, and that sound went through Silas like something physical. He started toward the bed, and Elowen held up one hand without looking at him. I know, she said. Let me work. He stopped. He sat down in the chair against the wall, the one he'd pulled in from his own room on the first night, and he put his elbows on his knees and his hands over his mouth, and he sat very still and watched. Elowen did not look at his face. She could not afford what was in it right now. She could feel it across the room, the weight of his fear, the particular texture of a man watching something terrible happen to someone he cannot protect. And she knew that fear, and she could not carry it and do what needed to be done at the same time. So she did what she had done when Thomas got bad, when the baby got bad, the things she had learned the hardest possible way. She divided herself. There was the part that felt everything that part was real, and it was there, and she knew it would come back to collect later, and there was the part that worked. The part that measured and assessed and adjusted and kept going. She sent herself into the second part, and she stayed there. She worked through the afternoon. She made Maisie swallow small amounts of the willow bark tea, coaxing it past clenched teeth with a patience she didn't know she still possessed. She changed the cloths every 10 minutes. She monitored the stove temperature with a precision that drove her to adjust it 3 times, because too hot was as dangerous as too cold when a child's body was already burning. She told Silas when to be in the room and when to be out of it, and he obeyed without resentment, which told her again what kind of man he was. At some point in the late afternoon, she registered that Garrett had put food outside the bedroom door. She ate it in the hallway, 4 bites of cornbread, standing up. Then she went back in. Silas was beside the bed when she returned. He had his hand over Maisie's under the blanket, not gripping, just covering. He looked up when Elowen came in, and she saw in his face the question he hadn't asked in 6 hours. She sat down on the opposite side of the bed, looked at Maisie, and measured what she saw against where they'd been that morning. She's not worse than 2 hours ago, she said. That's not better, he said. No, she agreed. But it's not worse at this stage that matters. He was quiet. Then you've seen this before. It wasn't a question. He'd understood that from the first night, from the way she'd moved, the way she'd given instructions without consulting anyone or anything, the terrible expertise of it. Yes, she said. He held the silence for a moment. What happened? She kept her eyes on Maisie. I lost them, she said. Flat, plain, no softening, both of them, Thomas first. Then the baby, 6 weeks later. She paused. The baby was 8 months old. His name was Samuel. She had not said his name to another person since the funeral. The word hung in the cold air of the room. Silas did not say he was sorry. He looked at her across his daughter's fever-heated body, and what he said was, "Then you know what you're doing." "I know more than I did then," she said carefully. "I don't know if it's enough." "It has to be," he said. Not as a demand, as the simplest possible statement of a truth neither of them could change. She looked at him, then really looked at him, for the first time all day, and what she saw was not just fear. It was a man who had decided to trust her completely with the only thing he had left, and who understood what it cost her to be here, in this specific position, fighting this specific fight. And who was asking her to do it anyway, because there was no one else. "I know," she said, "I know, the second night was colder." The temperature outside dropped past anything Garrett had a name for, and the wind found the gaps in the walls and the window frames and made itself known in the bedroom in ways that required them to hang a blanket over the single window to keep the draft off Maisie. The stove worked constantly. The woodpile was going down. Silas and Pete took turns through the night, keeping it fed, moving through the dark and the cold, and coming back inside with ice on their coats and hands that needed warming before they could do anything useful. Elowen did not sleep. She thought once, somewhere around midnight, that she should at least lie down for an hour, just an hour, and she recognized this thought as the point at which her body had stopped asking politely and was beginning to demand. She took a 20-minute stretch on the floor beside the bed, on top of a folded blanket, with her hand still resting on the mattress near Maisie's feet so that any change in the child's movement would wake her. It was not sleep. It was something slightly east of unconsciousness, and it had to be enough. Silas found her like that when he came back from the wood. He stood in the doorway for a moment, and then he came in quietly and stood over her, and she felt the warmth of him before she was fully awake, and she said, "She's the same," without opening her eyes. Because she'd been tracking Maisie's breathing, even in that half-sleep, and she knew. "Go to your room," he said. "Even an hour. I can't." Elowen, he said her name, not Mrs. Pierce, not Miss Pierce, just her name, the way you say someone's name when you've stopped having the energy for formality. "I'll watch her. I'll come get you immediately if anything changes." "I swear it." She opened her eyes. He was crouching beside her, which meant he was at her level, which was unusual enough to be startling. His face in the lamplight was exhausted and serious, and about 10 years older than it had been 48 hours ago. "You'll call me," she said, the moment her breathing changes. The moment she moves. Yes. If the fever spikes if she feels hotter than she does right now. "I'll come get you, I know. I've been listening to you for 2 days, Elowen." "I know what to look for," he said it without impatience. With something that was closer to gentleness than she'd expected from him at this level of exhaustion. She got up. She went to her room. She lay down in her clothes and was asleep in under 2 minutes, which told her how badly she needed it. He woke her 40 minutes later. She was on her feet before he finished saying her name. She was in Maisie's room in seconds. Maisie was not worse. She was different. She was moving. Not the restless, fever-driven thrashing of the previous night, but something more purposeful. One hand moving across the blanket toward the edge of the bed. Her face turned. Her eyes not quite open, but not closed in the way the deep fever sleep closed them. Elowen sat on the bed. She put her hand over Maisie's searching one. Maisie went still. Her lips moved. The word that came out was quiet and broken and uncertain the way words are when you're not fully sure if you're awake or asleep, when the fever has erased the boundary between those states. "Mama?" Elowen's breath stopped. She sat in the lamplight with Maisie's hot hand in both of hers, and the words sat in the room around her, enormous and simple, and she felt it in every place she had ever been broken, which was considerable. Silas was behind her. She could hear him breathing. She didn't answer immediately. Not because she didn't know what to do. She knew exactly what to do. She did it. She had always known, and it had never gotten easier, but because for just one breath's worth of time, she let herself feel the full weight of it. The little girl who had taken her empty hand at a stagecoach stop and decided something before Elowen had said a word. The little girl who left her door cracked at night. Who showed Elowen her rag doll like an act of trust. Who said your room is next to mine with a studied casualness that was the bravest thing Elowen had seen in years. Then she answered, I'm here, she said, quietly, steadily. Not falsely, not pretending to be something she wasn't. Just present, just the truth of who was holding Maisie's hand in this room at this hour. I'm right here, you're all right. Maisie's fingers curled around hers. Something eased in the child's body, a fraction, a degree, the specific relaxation of a person who has found the fixed point they were looking for in the dark. Elowen looked at the child's face, and she looked at her own hands holding Maisie's, and she kept her face composed because Silas was in the room and Maisie needed the fixed point, and she was the fixed. She was. She could be that. She had to be that. The composure lasted until she registered that the heat under her hands had changed. She pressed her palm to Maisie's forehead carefully, and then held very still, not trusting what she felt, rechecking it. Then she checked the child's wrist, then her neck. Silas, she said. He was beside her in a second. Put your hand here, she said. Her voice was doing something she didn't have full control over. She put his hand on Maisie's forehead, the way she'd guided his hands a dozen times in the past 2 days. He held it there. She watched his face. She watched the moment he felt it. His expression went through something. She had no word. For it started in his eyes and moved through his whole face, a crack opening in the composed surface of him, and what came through was so raw and so unguarded that she had to look away. Is that, he said? It's going down, she said. It's going down. He sat down, not chose to just sat, as if the bones had decided they were done holding him up for the moment. He sat on the floor beside the bed, one hand still on Maisie's, and he put his other hand over his face. And he made the sound that men make when they've been holding something enormous for too long and have finally been given permission to put it down. Elowen stayed where she was, on the other side of the bed, her hand over Maisie's, and she let him have that moment without looking, without speaking, without making him manage her reaction on top of his own. Then her own fell apart, not loudly. She did not cry the way some people cried. She cried the way she'd cried every hard time in her life, quietly, thoroughly, her face in her hands, her shoulders moving, making almost no sound at all. She cried for Maisie because the fever was going down. She cried for Samuel because no one had been able to do for him what she'd just done for this child, and the wrongness of that had never left her body. She cried for Thomas and for Clara, who Maisie called out for in her fever, and for the long, wearing strangeness of having traveled 1,000 miles into someone else's life and found that it fit in ways she hadn't expected and hadn't given herself permission to want. She cried for the ring the road agent had taken off her finger. She cried until she didn't have more, which did not take long, because she was that tired. When she lifted her face, Silas was looking at her. He had not said anything. He was still on the floor, his hand still over Maisie's, and he was looking at Elowen with the expression of a man who has just watched someone do something extraordinary and is deciding whether he has the right to say so. Go ahead, she said, her voice wrecked. Whatever you're going to say. He was quiet for a moment. Then thank you seems too small. It's enough, she said. It isn't. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. Silas, I know. He looked back at Maisie, at the child's face, which was there was no other word for it easier. The tight, fever-held expression was smoothing out, and her breathing was slowing towards something more natural, the spacing between breaths, lengthening into something closer to rest than collapse. She's going to need a few days, Elowen said, pulling herself back to the practical because it was where she functioned best. The fever coming down doesn't mean it won't try to come back. We keep up the treatment through tomorrow, no change in the routine. She needs water when she can manage it, and broth before anything solid, and rest, real rest, not getting up to see the horses no matter how much she asks. And she will ask. I know, he said. She'll ask. She'll tell me you said it was fine. The corner of his mouth moved, just barely. I'll tell Gus not to let her talk her way around him. Good luck, Elowen said, and something in her voice was almost barely a different quality than the past 60 hours had allowed. He heard it. He looked at her. That almost not quite smile was still there, faint and exhausted and real. "You haven't slept," he said. "Neither have you. I'll watch her. You take the room. Real sleep this time, I mean it." She looked at Maisie. The child was resting properly now, the fever still there but retreating, her hand loose in Elowen's rather than gripping. "Another hour," Elowen said. "All night," Silas said. "Silas, she's over the worst of it. You said so yourself." He met her eyes. "You've given everything you have for 2.5 days. You are allowed to sleep." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked back at Maisie, really looked, making the final assessment she was constitutionally unable to skip, and she found what she was hoping to find. Not safety, not yet, but direction. The fever was moving the right way. The breathing was moving the right way. The crisis had not passed entirely, but it had crested, and the other side was visible. She stood up. Her legs were not entirely reliable. She braced one hand on the bedside table and found her footing, and she did not look at Silas while she did it because she had used all her reserve, and she did not want him to see how close to the edge she was. She went to the door. "Silas," she said, without turning. "Yeah, if she asks for me, I'll come get you," he said. "Even if it's 15 minutes from now." "All right," she said. She went to her room. She lay down in Clara's coat, which she still hadn't taken off, and she was unconscious before she'd finished the motion of closing her eyes. In Maisie's room, Silas sat beside his daughter's bed in the cold lamplight. He held her hand. He listened to her breathe. He thought about many things about Clara, about the 2 winters alone, about a woman who had arrived with nothing and had then spent 2.5 days demonstrating, in the most specific possible terms, what nothing did not mean. He thought about Maisie saying that word in the dark. He thought about the way Elowen had answered it, not with a correction, not with a careful redirection about who she was and what she wasn't and what the arrangement was. She had said, "I'm here," and she had meant it. He had heard the full weight of it in her voice, the way a word means something different when it is the exact true thing and not a polite approximation. He sat with his daughter through the small hours of that third night, and he thought about what he was going to do about it, and by the time the gray light began at the edges of the blanketed window, he had a fairly clear idea. He was not yet sure he had the courage for it, but he had the idea. Maisie woke up properly at mid-morning of the 4th day. She woke up the way people wake from serious illness, slowly, confused, with the washed-out quality of someone who has been somewhere interior and strange and is only now re-entering the regular world. She looked at the ceiling first, then at her father who was in the chair. Then at the doorway where Elowen was standing with a cup of broth she'd brought up the moment Gus reported movement on the stairs, which was Silas telling him to go get her. Maisie looked at Elowen for a long moment. Then she said, in a voice like paper, "I had bad dreams." "I know," Elowen said. She came in and sat on the edge of the bed and put the broth on the bedside table. "You were sick. Bad dreams come with it sometimes." "You were there," Maisie said, slowly, piecing it together the way fever patients did, working backward through the fog. "You kept talking." "Yes. What were you talking about?" "Apple trees," Elowen said. "Ohio, my mother's kitchen table." Nothing important. Maisie considered this. Then she said, "It helped." Good. The child's eyes were clearer now, more focused, and she was looking at Elowen with that old familiar weighing quality, measuring something. Then she said, "Were you scared?" Elowen didn't hesitate. "Yes." Maisie absorbed this, "But you stayed." "Yes." The child nodded once, slowly, in the manner of someone filing away a confirmed hypothesis. Then she looked at the broth. "Is that for me?" "Yes." "Small sips. Your stomach's been empty a long time." Maisie took the cup in both hands and sipped carefully and made a face at the temperature and sipped again anyway. Silas watched from his chair and said nothing. Outside, the storm had finally broken. The light coming around the edges of the window blanket was the particular clean, hard light of winter after a storm-sharp clear, the kind that made everything look newly defined. The snow on the ground and the walls and the rooftop would be deep. The roads would not clear for days. The ranch was still sealed in. But something inside the house had changed, and all three of them felt it, and none of them put a word to it yet, because there are moments when naming a thing too early is a kind of damage, and all three of them, in their different ways, knew that. Maisie finished half the broth and set the cup down and looked at Elowen. "Agnes is on the floor," she said. "Can you get her?" Elowen bent and picked up the rag doll from where she'd fallen off the bed sometime in the past 3 days, and she straightened her dress, the doll's dress, such as it was, a small square of worn calico, and handed her back. Maisie tucked the doll under her arm. Then, without looking at either adult in the room, she said, "I'm glad you didn't leave." She said it to no one in particular, which meant she said it to both of them, which meant she said it to the whole unsteady, imperfect, necessary arrangement of them, this man who didn't know how to ask for what he needed, and this woman who had arrived with nothing, and this child who had decided about all of it before anyone else could see clearly enough to decide anything. Neither Silas nor Elowen answered immediately. Then Silas said, "So am I." And Elowen said, looking at the cup in her hands, "Me too." And the three of them sat in the cold, clean light of the morning after the storm, and the fever was going down, and the roads were still closed, and none of them went anywhere. Maisie recovered slowly, the way children do after serious illness, not all at once, not in a clean upward line, but in fits and starts that could fool you into thinking she was better before she actually was. The first day she was awake and coherent, she tried to get out of bed to see the horses. Elowen caught her at the bedroom door, still in her nightgown, one hand on the doorframe like she was testing whether her legs would hold. "No," Elowen said. "I just want to see if Biscuit is all right in the cold." "Biscuit is fine. Garrett checked him this morning." "Garrett doesn't do it the way I do, Maisie." Elowen put both hands on the child's shoulders and turned her back toward the bed with a firmness that left no room for negotiation. "You had a fever that nearly put you past helping 3 days ago. You are going to get back in that bed, and you are going to stay there until I say otherwise, and I will personally go check on Biscuit and report back to you in full detail. Is that acceptable?" Maisie looked at her with those dark, evaluating eyes. "Full detail," she said. "Every particular," Elowen said. Maisie got back in bed. Elowen went out into the bitter cold in Clara's coat and stood in the barn for 5 minutes, getting a thorough account of a horse's condition that she then reported back with the kind of specificity that made Maisie's expression shift from suspicious to grudgingly satisfied. It was not the way Elowen had expected to spend a Thursday morning, but it was useful, and it was honest, and those two qualities covered most of what Elowen considered necessary in any given action. Silas saw her come back in from the barn and said nothing. But there was something in the way he watched her knock the snow off her boots that had been there, since the night the fever broke, a quality of attention that was different from before, more direct, less managed. Like he'd stopped keeping something at a careful distance and hadn't yet decided what to do about the fact that he'd stopped. She noticed. She didn't address it, because there was Maisie to recover and roads still blocked and enough practical work to occupy everyone on the property without adding that particular complication to the list. But she noticed. The roads opened on the 5th day after the storm, and the first person through them from town was Doc Hennessy, who had heard about Maisie's fever from a ranch 2 miles over, whose hands had passed the word along. He was a lean, gray-haired man who moved quickly for his age and spoke in the compressed, economical way of someone who had been delivering bad news, long enough to know that words were most valuable when you didn't use too many of them. He examined Maisie thoroughly. He asked questions about the progression of the fever, the temperature readings, the treatments applied, the timing of the willow bark, the method of cooling. He asked these questions of Elowen, and he listened to her answers with the same compressed attention he brought to everything. When he was done with Maisie, who had submitted to the examination with minimal complaint because she'd gotten a look at the expression on Silas's face and had made a practical decision, Doc Hennessy came downstairs. He stood in the kitchen and looked at Elowen across the table. "You managed this well," he said. It was not a compliment exactly, it was an assessment, precise and professionally delivered. The ice packs at that stage were the right call. A lot of people wouldn't have known to do that, or wouldn't have had the nerve. I've nursed fever before, Elowen said. I understand. He looked at her in a measuring way that was not unkind. I've heard you did it without a doctor and in the middle of the worst storm we've had in 6 years. She's going to be fine. Another week of rest, limited activity, keep her warm. He picked up his bag. You probably saved her life. Not probably, you did. He said it plainly, without flourish, and then he left, because that was how Doc Hennessy operated. Silas walked him out to his horse. Elowen stayed in the kitchen and sat down, which she did not do often in the middle of the day, and she sat there for several minutes with her hands flat on the table and the kitchen quiet around her. You saved her life. She had known it. She had known it in the way you know things that happen while you're too occupied doing them to stop and recognize what they are. But hearing it said in a plain declarative sentence by a man with 30 years of medicine behind him was a different thing. It settled into her in a way that felt both enormous and strange, the way unexpected things feel when they turn out to be true. She heard Silas come back in. She heard him hang his coat. She heard his boots on the kitchen floor. Then he was in the doorway, and she looked up, and what she saw in his face was not the careful composure or the managed distance. It was the expression she'd seen that night on the floor beside Maisie's bed, after the fever broke, when he'd put his hand over his face and made that sound. Wide open, undefended, he sat down across from her. He didn't say anything right away. He put his hands on the table and looked at them, and she waited, because she had learned that Silas Crowley said the right thing when he gave himself enough time to find it. I've been trying to figure out how to say something, he said. All right, she said. I've been trying since the night the fever broke. He looked up. I'm not very good at this. You should know that going in. I've noticed, she said gently. It's all right. He held her gaze for a moment. The arrangement we had, he said. What I told you when we got here, that you owed me nothing. That you'd have your own room and your own time and freedom to decide. He paused. That was the right thing to say then. I meant it then. I know you did, she said. I don't want that anymore, he said. The arrangement. I don't want to be... He stopped, found the words, started again. I don't want to be careful anymore. Around what this is. Around what you are to this house and to Maisie. Another stop. He pushed through it. To me. Elowen felt something begin to move in her chest, slow, cautious, the way things move when they've been still for a very long time and are not certain the ground will hold. Silas, she said carefully, you're exhausted, we both are. This week was, I know what this week was. He said it quietly, but with a precision that stopped her. I've been awake for most of it. I know exactly what state I'm in. I've also been thinking about this since before the storm, and the storm just... He opened one hand, a gesture that said, made it impossible to pretend otherwise. I'm not asking you for anything you're not ready to give. I want to be clear about that. But I'm not willing to sit across from you every morning and call you a guest when you haven't been a guest since about the second week. She was quiet. He let her be quiet. This was one of the things about him, the willingness to wait, to not fill silence with words that would make it easier on himself. He said what he meant, and then he gave you space to be in it, which was both respectful and, she was finding, somewhat unnerving. What happened to Thomas, she said slowly, working it out as she spoke, changed something in me that I've been carrying for 4 years. Something about she stopped, tried again. I stopped believing I was allowed to want things. Not because I decided to, just because wanting things had cost me more than I knew how to keep spending. She looked at the table. When I got on that stagecoach, when the robbery happened, I was almost relieved in a terrible way, because I thought you'd send me back, and then the decision would be made for me, and I wouldn't have to find out whether I could do this or not. But Maisie took your hand, he said. Yes. Her voice did something. She steadied it. She took my hand, and then you said she could come home, and she stopped. I told myself I was just here for her, that I was just doing a practical thing, useful thing, and I wasn't going to let it be anything more than that, because more than that was where the risk was, and I had already lost everything once when I let myself believe in more than that. Elowen. She looked up. Maisie called you Mama, he said. In the fever, you heard her. Yes. And you answered her. Yes, that's not a practical thing, he said. That's not a guest doing a useful thing. He held her gaze with a steadiness that she recognized as the same quality he brought to everything that mattered to him, the same steady, undeflected attention. I know what we both lost. I know we've both been careful for a reason. But I fell in love with you somewhere between the second and third week, and I've been carrying it around like it was a problem to be solved. And I'm tired. I'm just tired. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, she could hear the wind, which had been a constant presence for days, and the sound of Pete moving something in the yard, and the distant low voice of the cattle. The ordinary sounds of the ranch in winter, the sounds of a place that was functional and real. She thought about Thomas, who had been gentle and impractical, and who had loved her in a way that was warm and easy, the way a summer is warm and easy, and who was gone. She thought about Samuel, who had been 8 months old and had smelled like milk and warm sleep, and who was gone. She thought about the ring the road agent had taken off her finger and pocketed without looking at her, and how she had stood at the side of that road and thought, this is all I am. This is what remains. A woman with empty hands and a torn dress and no more people left to love. She thought about Maisie in the lamplight, showing her a piece of quartz. She thought about Maisie saying, your room is next to mine, in a voice that was casual and careful and brave. She thought about sitting on the edge of Maisie's bed every night, telling stories about imperfect people who lost things and found ways forward because she believed in those stories, because she had needed them herself. She thought about Silas on the kitchen floor at 4:30 in the morning drinking coffee with Gus, and about him listening to her with all of his attention, and about him saying, I need you to be useful tonight, with a directness that trusted her more than comfort would have. About him on the floor beside Maisie's bed with his hand over his face. About him just now saying, I'm tired, in a voice that was the most honest thing she'd heard him say. I lost my son, she said. She had said it once, upstairs, briefly. She was saying it now fully, looking at him, letting it be the whole truth. Samuel, he was 8 months old. He got sick 6 weeks after Thomas and I did everything I knew how to do, and it wasn't enough. I sat beside his bed for 3 days, and I did everything, and I couldn't. She stopped. Her voice had gone somewhere difficult. She brought it back. For a long time after, I thought the worst part was losing him. But the worst part, the part that broke something specific, was believing that I had failed him. That if I had known more, done more, been more capable, he would have survived. Silas was very still across the table, and then I was here, she said. And Maisie got sick. And I was terrified, Silas. I was more frightened than I have been since Samuel, because it was the same temperature, the same breathing, the same trajectory, and I knew exactly what it could become, and I made myself stay in it. Stay present, not disappear into the fear, because I thought, if I can keep this child alive, then maybe what happened with Samuel was not a failure of who I am. Maybe I just didn't know enough yet. Maybe her voice gave out entirely for a moment. She waited. Maybe I was supposed to learn the hard way so I could use it. Silas reached across the table. He put his hand over hers. Just that, no words. The same way Maisie had taken her hand at the stagecoach, the simple, deliberate weight of a decision. She looked at his hand over hers. She turned her hand over and held it. They sat like that for a while. The kitchen was warm, and the wind moved outside, and neither of them said anything for several minutes, which was entirely fine, because some things don't need words to be settled. Then Elowen said, I'm not ready to lose anyone else. Neither am I, he said. So if this is, she looked for the right phrase. If we're going to do this, whatever this is, I need you to understand that I am not a risk taker. I am a person who has already gambled everything once and lost it, and I can't approach this the way someone does who hasn't been where I've been. I know, he said. I'm going to be afraid sometimes, she said. I'm going to pull back sometimes, not because I've changed my mind. Just because, no, he said again. I do the same thing. He looked at her steadily. We're two people who've had everything taken once. We're not going to be easy about this, but I don't think easy is what either of us is looking for." She held his gaze for a long moment. Then something in her, something that had been held at a controllable distance for 4 years and for the past 2 months had been losing ground, steadily let go. Not dramatically. She did not cry. She didn't suddenly feel light or relieved in the simple ways of stories. She felt the truth of it, that she was sitting in a kitchen in Wyoming territory in February with a man who was tired in the same specific ways she was tired, who was asking her not for a performance of readiness, but for the actual complicated reality of who she was, and she was considering saying yes. "All right," she said. He looked at her. "All right?" "Ask me properly," she said later, "when we've both slept. When Maisie is stronger. Ask me when you can ask me in a full sentence and I can answer in one." The corner of her mouth moved. "But all right." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she had not seen on his face before, unguarded and a little astonished, as though the outcome he'd prepared himself for had not been this one. "All right," he said. The weeks that followed were not easy. She had warned him and he had warned her, and they were both right. Two people with significant damage don't suddenly smooth out because they've said something true to each other across a kitchen table. There were evenings when Silas closed up in a way she recognized as the old habit of containment, and she had to sit with the discomfort of not pushing it. There were mornings when she woke with the particular weight that the old grief brought, the specific gravity of Samuel's absence. And those mornings she was not much use to anyone before her second cup of coffee, and she had stopped apologizing for that. But there was also this, Maisie getting stronger, coming back to herself over the course of 2 weeks, first quiet and pale, then restless and frustrated. Then finally, a Thursday afternoon in mid-February, back at the corral fence with her arms folded over the top rail, watching Garrett work a young horse, clearly providing what she felt was critical supervisory commentary from a distance of 10 feet. Elowen watched from the porch. Silas came and stood beside her, close enough that his arm was against hers, which he had started doing small, unannounced increments of nearness. Nothing that required acknowledgement, just present. "She's going to try to ride him within the week," he said. "She's going to ask if she can," Elowen said, "and you're going to tell her to wait 2 more weeks. And she's going to tell Garrett," her father said, "it was fine, and Garrett is going to come get you." A silence. Then that's exactly what's going to happen. "I know," Elowen said. They stood side by side, watching Maisie lean further over the fence than was strictly safe, and neither of them moved to stop her. Because she was 7 years old and had survived a fever that should have broken her, and she deserved to lean on a fence and watch a horse in the February cold. The gossip in Redstone Hollow had not diminished during Maisie's illness. If anything, it had reorganized itself. The story of the mail-order bride who had nursed the Crowley girl through the worst fever the valley had seen in years had spread in the particular way that genuine events spread, slightly distorted at the edges but true at the center. The woman who had arrived in rags and asked for nothing had apparently refused to sleep for 3 days while the roads were impassable and the doctor couldn't get through. Ruth Callahan had not apologized. Elowen did not expect her to. But something shifted in the quality of what she encountered in town. Women who had observed her with a certain sideways caution began to speak to her directly. The woman who ran the post office, a Mrs. Aldridge who had lost 2 children to illness in her first years in the territory, found Elowen at the counter one afternoon and held her hand for a moment without explanation before letting it go. A rancher's wife named Helen Marsh stopped her on the street to ask, with specific and earnest questions, what Elowen had done for the fever and whether it would work for a child younger than Maisie. Elowen told her everything she knew, clearly with nothing held back. She did not yet understand what she was building, standing on that street in February, explaining what she'd learned to a woman she barely knew. She was just answering honestly, because it was what she did. The formal proposal happened on the last Saturday of February. It happened in the kitchen, which was appropriate, because the kitchen was where they had always talked seriously, where the lamp was warmest and the stove was going and the coffee was on, and the house had the particular quality it had. After Maisie was in bed, settled, quiet, the two of them with space to speak without managing a child's perceptions simultaneously. Maisie had been in bed for 40 minutes. Elowen was at the table with a needle and thread, repairing a seam in one of Maisie's coats that had been going since November. Silas sat across from her with coffee, and the particular quality of stillness that she'd learned preceded him, saying something he'd thought about carefully. She kept sewing, he said. I told you I'd ask properly. She set the coat down on the table. She gave him her full attention, which she felt the occasion required. He did not drop to his knee, which she was privately grateful, for it would have been unlike him, and she would not have known what to do with it. He stayed in his chair. He looked at her the way he looked at things that were important to him directly, without deflection, without softening it into something easier than it was. I'm not going to tell you it'll be simple, he said. We've both got history that's going to show up at inconvenient moments. I've got a daughter who has decided about you, but that doesn't mean she won't test every limit you set for the next 10 years. The ranch is not prosperous. It's functional, and there's a difference. And I am not, he paused. I am not the easiest person to live with. Gus would tell you that for free. Gus has told me that, Elowen said. Something moved in his face. Of course he has. Twice, she said. He breathed out through his nose, not quite a laugh, the nearest he sometimes got. Then he said, I want to marry you, not because Maisie needs a mother, though she does, and you already are one whether you have the name for it or not. Not because the ranch needs a woman who can manage a household, though that's also true. Because you walked off that stagecoach with nothing, and the first thing you did was offer to make things easier on me. And that was the moment I understood you weren't going to fit into any idea I'd had of what this might be. He held her gaze steadily. I want to marry you because you are who you are, and I haven't been able to look at that clearly enough to say so until now. Kitchen was very still. Elowen thought about empty hands. She thought about the stagecoach step and the dirt road and the ring coming off her finger and the certainty she'd had, standing in the Wyoming dust, that she had finally arrived at the end of what she was allowed. She thought about a small hand reaching up and taking both of hers. She thought about 3 days of fever and cold cloths and the sound of Maisie's breathing changing in the dark, and a man sitting on the floor beside his daughter's bed, learning what trust actually required of him. She thought about Samuel. She let herself think about Samuel fully, not the careful partial way she'd been doing it for 4 years to keep herself functional. She thought about his weight and his smell and the particular way he laughed before he could talk, and she let it be what it was, enormous and permanent and hers. And then, she thought, loving this family does not require me to put him down. He can come with me. Thomas can come with me. There is room. Yes, she said. Just that. One word, plain and direct, because she had learned that from him. Silas was quiet for a moment. He looked at her in that way. He had the full attention, nothing held back, and then he reached across the table, and she gave him her hand, and he held it the way he'd held it in this same kitchen 2 months ago, firmly and without performance. I'll get a ring, he said, when the roads are clear. It doesn't need to be. I know it doesn't, he said. I want to. She was quiet for a moment. There's something I'd like, she said carefully. If it's possible, he waited. The ring Thomas gave me, she said. The road agent took it. I know there's no way to get it back. I'm not, she stopped, found the line she was trying to walk. I'm not asking to replace it. It was what it was, and it belonged to what it was. But if the ring you get could be simple, not elaborate, something I can actually wear while I'm working. She looked at him. I'm not good with delicate things. I would break something precious. Simple, he said. Durable, yes, that I can do, he said. They sat in the warm kitchen with their hands across the table, and it was not a romantic scene in the way stories sometimes made. Such scenes there was no moonlight, no particular grace to it. There was coffee going cold and a coat with a broken seam on the table, and a 7-year-old asleep upstairs who had strong opinions about horses. There was a man who did not know how to be easy about difficult things, and a woman who had learned the hard way that difficult things were the ones worth doing. That was what it actually was, and it was enough. 3 days later, Maisie found out. She found out because she had a talent for knowing when adults were managing information, developed through 2 years of being a child in a household where no one had thought to manage expressions particularly well. She came down to breakfast on a Tuesday morning, looked at both of them in turn with those dark, careful eyes, and said without preamble, "Something happened." Silas and Elowen exchanged a look across the kitchen. "Yes," Elowen said. Maisie sat down at the table. She folded her hands on the surface in front of her with a precision that was somehow both 7 years old and 40. "Tell me," she said. Silas looked at Elowen. Elowen looked at Silas. This had not been rehearsed. "Your father asked me to marry him," Elowen said. And I said yes. Maisie looked at her hands on the table. She was quiet for long enough that both adults became slightly concerned. Then she looked up at Elowen, and her expression was the most complicated thing Elowen had seen on a child's face, layers and layers of it. The hope and the fear of hoping, the old familiar grief, the specific 7-year-old arithmetic of this is what I wanted, and now I'm frightened that wanting it made it breakable. "Does that mean you're staying?" she asked. "Yes," Elowen said. "That's exactly what it means." Another long pause. "For always?" Maisie said, and the smallness of the voice said everything the words didn't. All the nights talking to Agnes, all the things whispered to a rag doll about wanting a mother, all the waiting that a child does when they're trying not to want something too much in case it gets taken away. "For always," Elowen said. Maisie nodded once. Then she got up from the table, walked around it, and walked directly to Elowen and put her arms around her, not the tentative, sideways nearness of the first weeks, not the careful gravitational drift toward warmth. A full, deliberate embrace, the kind a child gives when they've decided they're done being careful about it. Elowen held her. She held her in the kitchen with the cold February light coming through the window, and Silas across the table watching them with the expression she had no word for, the one that lived somewhere between broken and repaired. And she held Maisie the way she had been holding everything she had left, carefully, completely, with the full understanding of what it cost and what it was worth. Gus came in from outside 3 minutes later, stamped the snow off his boots, took one look at the tableau in the kitchen, and turned to go back out without a word. "Gus," Silas said. Gus turned around. "They're getting married," Maisie said from within Elowen's arms, with a proprietary satisfaction that suggested she felt this outcome was at least partly attributable to her own management. Gus looked at Silas. Silas looked back at him with the expression of a man waiting for the verdict. Gus set down the firewood he'd been carrying. "Well," he said, in the tone of someone confirming a thing that had been obvious for some time, "it's about time." He picked the firewood back up and went to the stove. And that was all he said about it, which was everyone in the room understood, Gus's version of a full and comprehensive blessing. The wedding was set for April, when the worst of the cold would be past, and the roads would be reliable, and the ranch would be entering its working season with something other than survival as the dominant concern. There was no elaborate planning. Elowen had not come to Wyoming territory for elaborate anything, and Silas would not have known how to produce it. The minister from the next valley was asked. Helen Marsh was asked if she would stand with Elowen, and said yes immediately, in the way she said most things, directly and without ceremony. Garrett was going to be uncomfortable in his good coat, and was already resigned to it. Maisie, when consulted about her role, said she wanted to walk beside Elowen. "Not behind, not before, beside. That's not exactly traditional," Silas said. "I don't care," Maisie said. Elowen looked at the child. "Then that's what we'll do," she said. What happened in the 6 weeks before the April wedding was not a transformation. It was not a before and after. It was more like a continuation of what had already been happening, the incremental settling of people into each other, the slow building of ordinary life from the materials available, which were imperfect and sufficient. Elowen wrote a letter to the woman at the placement agency. She wrote it differently than the one she'd written on that ninth night in her room without the careful accounting of what was provisional and what was settled. She told the woman that she was staying, that she was going to be married, that she wanted the agency to know that the arrangement had been. She crossed out several words more than she had known to hope for. She did not write that she was happy, because happiness still felt like a word she needed to approach carefully, like a door you try before you trust your full weight to it. But she wrote, "I arrived in Wyoming believing I was finished. I am finding that I was wrong about that." She folded the letter and put it in the envelope and did not cross anything else out. Then she went upstairs, because she could hear Maisie attempting to teach Agnes a card game she'd learned from Gus, running both sides of the game with the kind of self-serious dedication that only children bring to invented tasks, and the sound of it was specific and small and alive, and she wanted to be in the same room as it. She went in without knocking, because Maisie had stopped closing her door weeks ago, and she sat on the floor beside the bed where Maisie was dealing cards to a rag doll, and she said, "What are we playing?" "Faro," Maisie said. "Agnes is losing." "Agnes always loses," Elowen said. "She's not strategic," Maisie said with great authority. Elowen picked up her hand without being asked and looked at her cards and lost 3 rounds in a row, which she was fairly certain was not entirely Agnes's fault, and the afternoon went on around them, warm and unremarkable, which was, she was beginning to understand exactly what it was supposed to be. The April wedding was not what anyone in Redstone Hollow had expected, mostly because no one in Redstone Hollow had expected there to be one at all. 6 months ago, when Silas Crowley's mail-order bride had stepped off the stagecoach looking like she'd been through something violent, the general consensus among the settlement's more invested gossips had been that the arrangement would dissolve before winter. A woman with no money, no possessions, no family within 1,000 miles, living in a single man's house on the basis of 4 months of letters, the arithmetic of it seemed simple. It would not last. It could not last. Ruth Callahan had said as much on at least 4 separate occasions, in at least 4 separate kitchens. In the way that people deliver predictions, they are simultaneously hoping to be proven wrong about and afraid they might be right. She had been wrong. The morning of the wedding was cold in the way that April in Wyoming was always cold, not the brutal killing cold of winter, but a thin, sharp cold that came off the mountains with something personal in it, like it hadn't quite decided to let the season turn. The sky was the high, pale blue of early spring, and the mud from the snowmelt had mostly firmed up, and the grass was beginning to consider coming back to life at the edges of the fields. And none of this was what Elowen was thinking about when she stood in front of the small mirror in her room and looked at the woman in it. She was wearing a dress that Helen Marsh had helped her make over the past 3 weeks. Not the plain brown she'd replaced her destroyed dress with in October, something better, though still practical, a deep blue-gray that Helen had found in the dry goods store in Laramie and brought back specifically, saying only that it suited her and leaving no room for argument. Elowen had put her hair up properly for the first time in months. She looked, she thought, like herself. Not a dressed-up version of herself, not a performance of someone who was getting married in a story. Just herself in good clothes on a significant day. There was a knock at her door. "Come in," she said. Maisie came in. She was wearing her best dress, the one Elowen had hemmed back in October, which she'd since grown out of at the hem again, and which they had let down twice, and her hair was braided the way Elowen had taught her to do it herself. Slightly imperfect at the back where she couldn't quite see, which Elowen had decided not to fix because Maisie had done it herself, and that mattered more than perfect. She was carrying Agnes under one arm, which had not been discussed, but which Elowen understood immediately was non-negotiable. Maisie stood in the doorway and looked at Elowen with those dark, appraising eyes. "You look nice," she said. In Maisie's register, this was the equivalent of an extended speech. "So do you," Elowen said. "You did your own braid." "It's crooked in the back." "I know, it's good." Maisie came in and stood beside Elowen and looked at both of them in the mirror. She was quiet for a moment, the particular quality of quiet she had when she was working up to something she'd been thinking in about for a while and hadn't yet committed to saying. Elowen waited. I know you're not my real mama, Maisie said. She said it carefully, without accusation, a statement of fact she needed to establish before she could say the next thing. My real mama was Clara, and she's gone. Yes, Elowen said. But she stopped, looked at Agnes rather than the mirror. I think she'd be all right with this, with you, because she was good at knowing what things needed. She paused. That's what Papa says about her, that she always knew what things needed. Elowen held herself together by a very small margin. Your mother sounds like she was remarkable, she said. She was loud, Maisie said, which was clearly a fond memory rather than a criticism. Papa said she laughed too loud for indoors, and she did it anyway. A pause. I try to be like that sometimes. You don't try, Elowen said. You just are. Something shifted in Maisie's face, the old wariness and the new trust doing what they had been doing for months, negotiating an arrangement she hadn't quite finished working out. Then she looked up at Elowen in the mirror and said, You can be my other mama. If you want, I can have two. Clara can be my first one, and you can be my other one. Elowen looked at the child in the mirror, at this 7-year-old who had taken her hand before anyone had asked her to, who had saved Elowen as surely as Elowen had saved her, who had said mama in a fever dark and reached for her, who had spent months doing the quiet, persistent, unsentimental work of making room. I would be honored, Elowen said. She said it plainly, because it was the plain truth. Maisie nodded as though this had been confirmed rather than decided, tucked Agnes more firmly under her arm, and said, We should go. Papa's been ready for a long time. He keeps adjusting his coat. How many times 4, Maisie said, that I saw. Elowen pressed her lips together against a smile. Then we'd better not keep him waiting. The ceremony itself was short. The minister from the next valley was a practical man who understood that the people of this territory had not come here for elaborate ritual. They had come here to build something. And their time was the most valuable thing they had, and he respected that. He said what needed to be said, clearly and without decoration, and when he got to the part that asked them to make promises, he let them make them. Silas's voice was steady. His hands, holding hers, were warm and slightly calloused from the fence work and the cold, and when he said he would take her and stand beside her and not leave, he said it the way he said everything that mattered, looking directly at her. Without performance, in the tone of a man who has thought about what the words mean and means them specifically. Elowen said her part, and her voice only broke slightly, once on the word keep, and she steadied it and finished. Maisie stood beside her the whole time, as she'd asked to, with Agnes under her arm and her chin up, and the expression of someone who has been waiting for this particular arrangement to become official for quite some time. There was no elaborate celebration after. Helen Marsh had organized a gathering at the Crowley Ranch Food and Neighbors, and the kind of informal warmth that frontier communities produced when they weren't in the business of being skeptical, which was its own kind of community, the better kind. Ruth Callahan came, which surprised Elowen. She came with a covered dish and a slightly complicated expression, and she found Elowen near the kitchen, and she said stiffly, I heard what you did for the child in the fever. It was nothing that needed doing more than once, Elowen said. People are saying you saved her life. Doc Hennessy said so. I only did what I knew how to do. Ruth looked at her for a moment. Then she said, I wasn't kind to you when you arrived. Elowen looked back at her. No, she agreed. I had a reason, Ruth said. Not a good one. When my sister came west to marry someone she'd only written to, it went badly. He wasn't, it was a bad situation. She paused. I see that's not what happened here. No, Elowen said. It's not. Ruth nodded, in the way of someone who does not apologize easily, but has come close enough to mean it. Then she put her dish on the table and went to find somewhere else to stand, which was probably as much as either of them could expect, and Elowen found she was all right with that. Gus, who had cooked for the gathering because he trusted no one else to do it adequately, and had said so without embarrassment, found her later in the afternoon and pressed a cup of coffee into her hands and said, You holding up? Yes, she said. Are you? I've been at this ranch for 9 years, he said. I've held up through worse than a wedding. He looked at her over his cup. He's better than he was. Silas, you should know that. He's better than he was before you came. She was quiet for a moment. So am I, she said. Gus drank his coffee and said nothing else, which was fine, because that exchange had contained everything that needed to be said. The thing about Redstone Hollow was that it was a small place in a large and sometimes brutal territory, and small places in brutal territories had long memories and short distances between people. What happened to one family reached other family eventually through weather, through commerce, through the particular intimacy of people who depended on each other's continued existence. Elowen had understood this abstractly when she arrived. She understood it concretely by the following autumn. It started with the Morrison family, 8 miles east. Their youngest, a boy of 4 named Clarence, went down with something in September that his mother Sarah recognized immediately as the same kind of fever that had nearly taken Maisie. The roads were passable, but the doctor was 2 days' ride in the opposite direction, and Sarah Morrison was alone with the child while her husband was at the fall cattle drive, and she had enough presence of mind to send her older boy, 11-year-old Frank, on horseback to Crowley Ranch. Frank arrived at 6 in the morning, his horse lathered, his face white under the cold. Elowen had him inside and warmed before she'd asked a single question. Then she asked questions, quick, specific ones about the boy's temperature and breathing and how long and what they'd done already, and she listened to Frank's answers with the focused precision she brought to everything medical. And then she turned to Silas, who was already putting his coat on. "I need to go," she said. Garrett's already getting the wagon," he said. She looked at him. He had heard Frank arrive and had started moving before she'd finished her assessment, which was the kind of thing you learned about a person over the course of a winter of emergencies and an April wedding and the 6 months of ordinary life that followed. "Maisie, Gus is here. Go." She went. She spent 36 hours at the Morrison homestead, during which Clarence Morrison's fever peaked and broke, and he came back to himself a shaky, slightly bewildered 4-year-old who wanted his mother and was deeply uninterested in the woman with the cold cloths, a position that Elowen found entirely fair. Sarah Morrison did not sleep for most of that time, staying at her son's side with a ferocity that Elowen recognized and respected. Elowen stayed beside her, talking her through it, keeping her from the particular terror that takes over when you're alone and afraid, and the night is very long. When it was over, when Clarence was sitting up and eating broth and demanding to see the dog, Sarah Morrison sat at her kitchen table and put her face in her hands and cried for 10 minutes straight, the kind of crying that happens when the body finally believes the crisis is finished. Elowen sat with her and didn't say anything and refilled her coffee. When Sarah looked up, her face was red and exhausted, and she said, "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't need to," Elowen said. "Elowen, I know what it is to be alone with a sick child," Elowen said quietly. "I know what it is to not have what you need when you need it. I couldn't stand by if I could help. That's not a virtue. It's just what you do." Sarah looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "Frank said you came without being paid." "Frank was right. Silas didn't ask me to come. I'm going to be clear about that. This was my choice. It is always going to be my choice." She picked up her cup. "Drink your coffee. Your son is going to be awake in an hour, and he's going to have a great deal to say about that dog." By the following spring, a full year after the wedding, Elowen had been called to 4 homesteads. A fever, a difficult birth where the midwife couldn't get through the mud, a farm hand, with a bad cut that needed cleaning and stitching that she did with the same matter-of-fact precision she brought to mending Maisie's coat. Doc Hennessy heard about the birth assistance and came out to the ranch one afternoon specifically to speak with her. She met him on the porch, uncertain what to expect. He was carrying a satchel. "I've been thinking," he said, "about the territory and the distances and the fact that I can only be in one place at a time, which is a problem that has not improved with age." He put the satchel on the porch rail. "I'm going to teach you everything I know about fever management, wound care, what to do in a difficult birth when a doctor isn't present, what can kill a person and what won't, and how to tell the difference. He looked at her steadily. You already know half of it. I'd rather you know all of it and do it right than know half and do the best you can. Elowen looked at the satchel, then at him. Why, she said. Because you're already doing it, he said plainly. And because people are writing to you instead of waiting for me, which tells me something about what they need and what they trust. He paused. And because I saw what you did for the Crowley girl, and I've been practicing medicine for 30 years, and I know the difference between someone who was lucky and someone who was good. She was quiet for a moment. I lost people, she said. Before my husband, my son, I know, he said, I lost patients. A lot of them. You learn from it, or you don't, and you've clearly learned from it. He picked up the satchel. Tuesday mornings, 3 hours, you can work around the ranch schedule. That was how it began. Silas found out about the Tuesday sessions from Gus, who found out from Garrett, who had seen Doc Hennessy's horse outside the ranch 3 Tuesdays in a row and had the social awareness to understand this was not random. Silas did not find out from Elowen because she had not told him, not because she was hiding it, but because she was still deciding what she thought about it, and she needed to decide before she could discuss it. He waited until she told him, which she did on the 4th Tuesday evening. She explained it the way she explained most things directly, without softening it with the particular edges left visible. She told him about Doc Hennessy's offer, and what she was learning, and why she thought it mattered, and also that she did not know what to do with the version of herself that was doing it. That she had arrived in Wyoming territory believing she was the kind of person that things happened to, not the kind of person who went out into the world and made things happen. That she was not sure when that had changed. Silas listened to all of it without interrupting. When she was done, he said, "Does it feel right, the work?" She thought about Clarence Morrison's fever breaking, about Sarah Morrison's face lifting out of her hands, about the farmhand with the cut who had shaken her hand very carefully afterward, like she might be made of something valuable. "Yes," she said. "Then do it," he said. "It takes time away from." "The ranch runs," he said. "Gus has been running the kitchen since before either of us got here. Maisie is going to be in school starting September." He looked at her across the table where they had said important things to each other before. "Elowen, you have been taking care of other people your whole life. This is the same thing, only now you know more and there's more of you to give." He paused. "That's not me being generous. That's me saying I know who you are." She looked at him. He was not wrong. She had been taking care of people her whole life, Thomas, Samuel, her students, when she'd taught briefly in Ohio, Maisie, Silas in the quieter ways he did not always acknowledge needing. The work with Doc Hennessy was not a departure from who she was. It was more of the same, wider. It was what happened when you had survived enough to have something real to offer. "Maisie's going to want to learn," she said. "She's been following me around asking questions since the Clarence Morrison business." Silas rubbed his face with one hand. "Of course she is." "She's not bad at it," Elowen said. "She's better with sick people than you'd expect. She stays calm. She gets that from Clara," he said automatically, and then looked slightly surprised at himself, the way he sometimes did when Clara came out of him naturally, without effort or grief just present, just part of the ongoing fabric of who the family was. He had been doing that more. The name had stopped costing him the same amount. "She does," Elowen said. "She told me Clara knew what things needed. I think Maisie does too." There was a warmth in the room that had nothing to do with the stove. Silas looked at her that full, undeflected attention and said, "You talked to her about Clara." "She brought it up," Elowen said, "on the morning of the wedding. She told me about her." He was quiet for a moment. Something in his face did the complicated thing it did when Clara came up, not grief exactly, not anymore, something more settled and more survivable than grief. "What did she say?" "That she laughed too loud for indoors and did it anyway." Elowen looked at him. "And that she was good at knowing what things needed." He was quiet for a longer moment. Then he said, "That's exactly right." The second winter passed without a crisis. This was not nothing in Wyoming territory. A winter without crisis was its own kind of achievement. The woodpile was adequate. The cattle came through. Maisie, who had been put on a horse in October under conditions of intense negotiation involving Elowen, Silas, Garrett, and Agnes as moral support, was riding with increasing confidence by the time the first snow came, which she seemed to regard as a personal achievement of great magnitude, which it was. The Tuesday sessions with Doc Hennessy continued. By midwinter, Elowen was not just learning from him, she was sometimes instructing him in the specific and narrow ways that her experience gave her knowledge he hadn't encountered. The fever management techniques she had developed through loss and then refined through Maisie's illness turned out to have a precision that surprised him. He was not a man who was easily surprised. "Where did you learn this?" he asked one Tuesday about a particular method she described. "I didn't," she said. "I worked it out." He looked at her for a moment. "You worked it out. Through trial and error," she said. Mostly error at first. He wrote it down. He wrote down several things she told him over those months, which she found uncomfortable and eventually accepted, because he explained, with his usual compression, that knowledge that lived only in one person's head was lost when that person was gone, and that was a waste, and waste offended him professionally. She understood that particular argument. She had felt the specific loss of knowledge when Thomas died, things only he had known about their farm, their animals. The particular way the cold came into the back bedroom, and it had added a layer to the grief that she hadn't expected and couldn't explain to anyone. She let him write things down. The third year brought something she had not expected. In June, Elowen realized she was carrying a child. She did not tell Silas immediately. She held it for 3 days, which she spent in a state of feeling she could not adequately describe something between joy and terror, so completely intertwined she couldn't separate them. Joy because this, terror because she knew what could happen, had known it with a specificity that most people didn't have, had held Samuel for 8 months, and then lost him and spent 4 years carrying that loss in every room she entered. She told him on the 4th day. She told him plainly, sitting at the kitchen table where they always told each other things that mattered. She said what she knew, and she said what she was afraid of, and she didn't dress either of those things up. He listened to all of it. Then he reached across the table and took her hands. And what he said was not everything is going to be fine, because he knew her well enough to know she would not believe that, and would be right not to. And he was not a man who said things he couldn't stand behind. What he said was, "We'll do it together, whatever happens." "That's not a promise I can hold you to," she said. "Not about outcomes." "I know," he said. "It's a promise about what I'll do." "Not what happens." He held her hands. "Those are the only promises that are actually in our control." She looked at him. This was, she thought, one of the most honest things anyone had ever said to her, the clear-eyed distinction between what you can control and what you cannot, between the promise of presence and the illusion of protection. "All right," she said. She was afraid for most of the pregnancy. Not constantly, not in a way that paralyzed her. She didn't have the luxury of paralysis. There was Maisie, and the ranch and the Tuesday sessions, and the ongoing fact of life that required participation. But underneath everything, there was a thread of fear that she kept hold of the way you keep hold of something in a current, not because you plan to use it, but because letting go feels dangerous. Doc Hennessy knew because she told him at the next Tuesday session, and he modified what they were working on accordingly, and he was matter-of-fact about the fear in a way that helped more than comfort would have. He told her what the actual risks were and what they weren't, and he told her what to watch for and what the signs of trouble looked like. And this specific information helped more than reassurance, because she was a person who functioned better with facts than with soothing. Maisie knew by August, because Maisie was 8 years old and observant to a degree that sometimes alarmed adults. She came to Elowen one afternoon while Elowen was sitting on the porch resting, which she was doing more of now, under instructions, and sat down beside her and said without looking at her, "Are you going to have a baby?" "Yes," Elowen said. Maisie was quiet for a moment. "Is that scary?" Elowen looked at the fields, which were going the gold brown of late summer, the grass long and dry under a sky, that was starting to show the first hints of autumn blue. Yes, she said, it's very scary, because of what happened before. Elowen had told Maisie about Samuel. She had told her carefully. A few months after the wedding, when Maisie had asked about the baby she'd mentioned once during the fever crisis. She had told her in the same register she used for the stories honest, specific, not made pretty. Maisie had listened to the whole thing without interrupting, and then said, in a quiet voice, "That's the saddest thing I've ever heard." And then she had taken Elowen's hand, which was its own kind of grace. "Yes," Elowen said, "because of what happened before." Maisie leaned against her side. This was something she did now without announcement, the casual physical ease of a child who has decided you are a safe place and sees no reason to make ceremony of it. "I was scared when I was sick," Maisie said, "in the fever. I couldn't always tell what was real, but I was scared." "I know," Elowen said, "but you were there," Maisie said. "So I kept coming back because you were a fixed place." She was quiet. "I'll be a fixed place for you if you get scared." Elowen looked down at the top of Maisie's head, the braid, slightly imperfect at the back, which she still insisted on doing herself. "You already are," she said. The baby came in February, which was, Elowen later thought, exactly the right month for things to happen in Crowley Ranch, February having established itself as the season of crisis and resolution, the month that tested what the family was made of, and then showed them they were made of something that held. The birth was hard. She had known it might be. Doc Hennessy was there. She had made that arrangement months in advance, refusing to leave it to chance, and Helen Marsh was there, and Silas was in the house and not in the room, because there was nothing useful for him to do in the room. And Elowen had told him so plainly, and he had accepted this because he trusted her judgment, and had spent 4 hours in the kitchen with Gus not saying anything, which Gus reported to Elowen afterward was one of the longer silences either of them had ever maintained. A girl, 6 pounds, 3 ounces, with dark hair and a voice like she had opinions already. Doc Hennessy put her in Elowen's arms and said, "She's healthy. You did well." Plain and clear, the way he said everything. Elowen held her daughter, and the fear and the joy were still intertwined, still impossible to separate, but the specific quality of the fear had changed. It was no longer anticipatory, no longer the fear of something that might happen. It was the fear of someone who holds something enormous and knows its value and does not intend to set it down. She held her, and she thought about Samuel, the weight of him and the specific warmth, and she did not push the thought away. She let it be present. She let Samuel exist in the room in the way she had learned to let him exist, not as a wound, not as an absence exactly, but as the shape of what she had loved and still loved. The love itself being the thing that survived even when the person didn't. She thought, "I can do this. I am terrified, and I know exactly what I could lose, and I am going to do this anyway." Silas came in when Doc Hennessy called him. He stood at the bedside and looked at his wife and his daughter with an expression that was the most unguarded Elowen had ever seen on his face, more even than the night Maisie's fever broke. Because that night had been relief from a terror, and this was something without the terror, or with a different kind, the kind that comes from pure unprepared love. He sat on the edge of the bed, and she put the baby in his arms and watched him hold her. This man who had been a contained and careful person for as long as anyone on the ranch could remember, who did not make ceremony of things, who said, "I'm tired," rather than "I love you" the first time, because he was honest, and it was the truer version. He looked up at Elowen. His eyes were doing something his face was trying to manage, and not quite succeeding at. "Clara," he said, "if that's—" He stopped. "I thought if you were willing." Elowen looked at him. She thought about Maisie on the porch, saying she could have 2 mothers, about the way a family makes room, about the truth she had learned over 2 winters and a wedding and 100 Tuesday mornings that love was not a fixed quantity that ran out when divided. It was more like the bread she taught Maisie to make. You started with what you had, and if you tended it right, it grew. "Clara," she said. "Yes." Maisie met her sister 20 minutes later, sitting very carefully on the bed the way you sit when you understand you are in the presence of something significant. She held Clara with the concentration of someone being trusted with something irreplaceable, her arms rigid with the effort of holding exactly right. Then she looked up at Elowen with wide eyes and said, "She's very small." "You were that small once," Elowen said. Maisie looked back at the baby with an expression that contained multitudes the awe, the first stirring of the particular love that older children feel for the helpless, smaller ones, and beneath it something more complicated. The 8-year-old working out that the world was larger than it had been this morning. "Does she know yet?" Maisie said, "that she's in a good place?" Elowen looked at her elder daughter, holding her younger one. She looked at Silas on the other side of the bed, his hand resting near but not touching because he didn't want to crowd Maisie's moment. She thought about October of the previous year and a stagecoach step and a dirt road and empty hands. "No," she said, "she'll learn. The years passed the way years do in a working life, not all at once, not dramatically, in the accumulation of ordinary days that only look significant in retrospect." Clara grew from the small and opinionated infant into a small and opinionated child who had her father's stubbornness and her mother's precision, and who drove Maisie to genuine exasperation at least twice a week, which Maisie bore with the long-suffering dignity of an older sister who had decided that exasperation was simply part of the arrangement. Maisie, at 12, was already taller than Elowen and still growing, and she had started sitting in on the Tuesday sessions when Doc Hennessy came, not because anyone had formally invited her, but because she had simply been there one Tuesday, and no one had asked her to leave. Doc Hennessy had, after the third such occurrence, started directing questions at her. She answered them with the same compressed accuracy she brought to everything, and he had looked at Elowen afterward and said, "She's going to do this work," meaning medicine, meaning the thing they were doing together. "Whether or not anyone points her at it." "I know," Elowen said. "She'll need more than I can teach her out here eventually." "I know that, too." It was a conversation they would return to, in various forms, over the following years. Silas had changed in ways that were difficult to quantify and impossible to miss. He was not the same man who had stood outside the general store turning his hat in his hands, though he was clearly the same man, the same directness, the same quality of attention, the same preference for the true word over the comfortable one. But the sealed places in him had been opened carefully over time by a woman who had never forced any of them, and had instead simply made the house warm enough that remaining sealed became a choice rather than a necessity. He laughed more. Gus had noted this on multiple occasions, with the satisfaction of someone whose prediction had been confirmed. He was not loud, he would never be loud. That was Clara's territory, and increasingly Maisie's, but there was something easier in him, more available. He still talked to Clara, his first wife, occasionally. He had told Elowen this early in their marriage, in the way he told her things that he had decided she should know, plainly, without apology, with the implicit understanding that she would accept it as part of the full truth of who he was. She had accepted it. She still talked to Thomas and Samuel. These things were not secrets, and they were not competition. They were the ongoing presence of the people who had shaped them, which was simply true, and which the family had found a way to make room for the same way they had made room for everything else, not by forcing it, but by not refusing it. The ring Silas had bought for the wedding was simple and durable, as she had asked. It had been on her finger for 3 years now, and it was beginning to show the wear of a working life a slight thinning on one side, from the mending and the medical work, and the bread and the cold clothes wrung out for sick children. She had not had it replaced. She liked what the wear meant. She liked that it was a record of what she'd done. The road agents were never caught. This was something she had made a deliberate peace with, somewhere in the second year. There had been a period brief, not something she spoke of much when she had thought about the ring and the trunk and the keepsakes that had been taken from her, and had felt a specific cold anger that she recognized as appropriate and knew she could not live inside indefinitely. She had let it exist, and she had let it pass, and what remained was not forgiveness exactly, which felt too large and too loaded a word, but something more like indifference. They had taken things, and she had built more things. And the arithmetic of it, while not balanced, was no longer the account she was keeping. The one thing she still felt clearly and without apology, was the loss of the ring Thomas had given her. Not because it was the ring, she was not sentimental about objects in the way some people were, but because of the moment it left her hand. The road agent looking her in the eye while he took it. The casualness of the cruelty, the complete absence of any acknowledgement that she was a person to whom this meant something. She had been in that moment nothing. A person could be robbed of possessions and rebuilt. The particular memory of being treated as nothing took longer to argue with. What had argued most effectively with it, in the end, was not time. It was Maisie taking her hand at the stagecoach, the specific and deliberate and entirely unasked-for act of being chosen by someone who had no practical reason to choose her. You cannot be nothing when a child decides you are something. The claim is too specific, too witnessed. In the autumn of the 4th year of their marriage, a woman arrived in Redstone Hollow on the weekly stage, looking like she had survived her journey badly. Her name was Margaret, she was 32, and she had come from Missouri to marry a man named Aldrich, who ran a small operation north of town. She had no obvious damage, no bruises, no torn dress, but she had the quality Elowen recognized immediately from considerable personal experience. Someone who had arrived at a new life with everything they owned and was not at all certain it was enough. Helen Marsh brought her to the ranch the second day. Not because anything specific had happened, just because, she said, she thought it might be useful. Elowen sat with Margaret in the kitchen and gave her coffee, and did not ask questions that would embarrass her. She answered the ones that were asked. She told a few carefully selected things about her own arrival, not everything, but enough. About the stagecoach step and the empty hands and the man and the daughter who had done something unexpected. Margaret listened and held her cup in both hands, the way people hold something warm when they're cold, in a way that isn't about temperature. "Were you afraid?" Margaret asked. "Every day for months," Elowen said. "And then less often, and then sometimes. And now when I'm afraid, it's usually about something real rather than everything in general." "Does it help?" Margaret said. "To know someone else was afraid?" Elowen thought about this honestly. "It helps to know someone was afraid and it didn't kill them," she said. "And that what they were afraid of losing, they didn't always lose. And the things they did lose, they survived." She paused. "That's not comfort exactly. It's more like evidence." Margaret looked at her. "Evidence of what?" "That people can hold more than they think they can," Elowen said. "That's the thing nobody tells you, not that it won't hurt. Just that you can hold more than you think." Margaret nodded slowly, the nod of someone filing something away. She married Aldrich the following month, and the marriage was imperfect and workable in the way that honest marriages are. And she was one of the women who came to Elowen 2 winters later when her youngest got the fever, and she recovered. And these were the threads of connection that Redstone Hollow was made of, one family to another. One winter survived, becoming the knowledge that made the next winter survivable. On a September evening in the 5th year, Elowen sat on the porch as the light was going and watched the field that ran south from the ranch house to the tree line, where Maisie was attempting to convince Clara, now 4, that the correct way to approach a horse was slowly and with respect. And Clara was demonstrating her usual relationship with other people's instructions, which was to hear them and then do the interesting thing instead. Silas came out and sat beside her. They watched their daughters in the field. Clara made a sudden movement, and the horse sidled, and Maisie grabbed her sister's arm with the smooth speed of someone who has been living with Clara for 4 years and has developed a preventive instinct. Clara looked up at her sister with an expression of pure indignation and said something they couldn't hear from the porch. And Maisie said something back in the tone of someone who has had this particular conversation before and intends to win it eventually. 5 more years, Silas said, and they'll be the most competent and most arguing pair in the valley. Less than 5, Elowen said. He put his arm around her, which he did sometimes without announcement, the casual, easy weight of it, and they sat and watched the field go golden in the last of the light. She thought about the stagecoach step. She thought about it the way she sometimes did, not painfully, not in the way of trauma, but in the way you return to a beginning, when you want to understand where you are. The dirt road, the bruise, the empty hands, the certainty that she had run out of what she was allowed. She thought about Maisie walking toward her. There is a thing that happens sometimes when you have lost so much that you begin to believe loss is your natural condition. You start to calculate your life in terms of what can still be taken. Every good thing becomes a liability. Every love becomes a potential wound. You carry the future's grief in the present tense because you cannot bear to be surprised by it again. What no one had told Elowen, and what she had learned the long way, was that this calculation was wrong. Not because bad things stopped happening, they didn't. Clara would be sick sometimes. Silas would close up sometimes. The winter would be brutal sometimes. Loss was not finished with her. She understood that with the clarity that only real experience gives. But the calculation was still wrong, because the things that could be taken were also the things that made the taking matter. You could not protect yourself from grief. By refusing love, you could only ensure that the grief, when it came, would be for something that hadn't been fully lived. And that, she had decided, somewhere in the long fever nights, and the kitchen conversations, and the Tuesday mornings with Doc Hensey, and the ordinary accumulation of a life that was hers and was real, that was the worst loss. She had arrived with empty hands. A lonely little girl had filled them. And Elowen Pierce, Elowen Crowley, now, though she thought of herself as both, the way a river is both the water that came before and the water coming now, had learned that hands emptied by loss and hands filled by choice were not opposites. They were the same hands. They were her hands, and what they held, she held on purpose, with full knowledge of what it cost and what it was worth. In the field, Clara had somehow ended up on the horse's back, placed there by Maisie, who was clearly going to have to explain this to their father. Clara sat with her chin up, and her small hands buried in the horse's mane, looking exactly like someone who had decided that this was where she belonged, and could not understand why it had taken everyone so long to arrange it. Silas saw. He straightened. Elowen put her hand on his arm. "She's fine," she said. "Maisie has her." He looked at the field. He looked at Maisie standing at the horse's head with one hand on the bridle and the other on Clara's knee, steady and matter-of-fact, completely in charge of the situation. Then he settled back. "She does," he said. The last of the light went over the mountains. The field went blue, and then gray, and then the first stars appeared, which in Wyoming came in a quantity that still occasionally surprised Elowen, a woman from Ohio where the sky was smaller. The girls came in from the field, Clara talking continuously about the horse, with the authority of someone who has done something once and considers herself an expert. Maisie walking beside her with the long-suffering patience of someone who knows that love and exhaustion are not mutually exclusive. They came onto the porch. Clara climbed directly into Elowen's lap without invitation, which was how Clara operated, and settled there with the complete physical ease of a child who has never doubted where home is. Maisie sat on the step and leaned back against her father's leg and looked out at the dark field and said nothing, which was also how Maisie operated. They sat there, the four of them, in the September dark. Not perfect. Not finished. There is no finished in a life. Only the ongoing, the next winter, and the next sickness, and the next ordinary morning. Not without their ghosts, who were present and accounted for, and belonged there, Thomas and Samuel and Clara Huazgone, and the ring on a road agent's finger somewhere that Elowen had stopped trying to locate. All of it present, all of it held. The house behind them was warm and lit, and Gus was making something that smelled like it would be worth coming inside for, and the horses were settled in the barn, and the field was quiet under the beginning of the stars. And this was what they had built, the four of them, out of loss and letters, and a stagecoach step, and a child who made a decision before the adults understood what there was to decide. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.